It began not on the battlefields of Europe, but behind barbed wire just outside Munich. In March 1933, only weeks after Hitler seized power, a camp was built on the grounds of an abandoned munitions factory. Its name was Dachau, and it became the model for an entire system of fear, control, and human suffering that would spread across the continent. Here the foundations of terror were laid long before the war began, in a place where political opponents were broken, where new methods of brutality were tested, and where the very idea of a concentration camp took root. At first, Dachau was a camp for so-called enemies of the state. Communists, socialists, priests, intellectuals, anyone who dared oppose the Nazi regime. But over time, its purpose evolved, its machinery of repression refined, and its gates opened to countless others marked by ideology, race, or religion. Prisoners endured forced labor, hunger, disease, and punishment designed not just to control their bodies, but to destroy their spirit. This was not a battlefield of guns and tanks, but of silence, watchtowers, and the constant presence of death. The SS guards honed their cruelty here, setting standards that would echo through places like Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz. Experiments were carried out under the guise of science, men and women reduced to subjects for inhuman trials. Yet within the barbed wire, there were also moments of resilience, solidarity, and acts of quiet defiance that preserved dignity in the face of despair. When the war finally turned against Germany, Dachau became even more overcrowded, chaotic, and desperate. Death marches and mass suffering marked its final months. And in April 1945, when American troops liberated the camp, the world was confronted with undeniable evidence of what had been done inside its walls. The photographs, testimonies, and shocked reactions of liberators would forever cement Dachau as both a symbol of horror and a warning to history. Tonight, we will walk through the entire history of Dachau, from its creation in the early days of Nazi rule, to its role in the wider camp system, and finally to its liberation and legacy. This is the story of the first Nazi concentration camp, told in full, in detail, and with the weight it deserves. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there right now. It's always incredible to see how people all around the world gather here to reflect, learn, and remember together. In the quiet Bavarian countryside, just outside the medieval town of Dachau, a place was built that would come to symbolize the machinery of terror in the Third Reich. Established in March 1933, only weeks after Adolf Hitler seized power, Dachau was the first official concentration camp sanctioned by the Nazi regime. Its creation marked a decisive shift from improvised violence by stormtroopers to a systematic state-controlled institution of repression. At first, Dachau was described by the Nazis as a temporary holding facility for political enemies, but it quickly evolved into something far darker. Here the SS developed methods of surveillance, punishment, and control that would later be exported to camps across occupied Europe. Theodor Eicke, one of its early commandants, implemented strict regulations, creating a template for camp discipline and brutality that became standard throughout the Nazi system. Dachau was not the largest camp, nor the deadliest, but it carried immense symbolic weight as the original model. Its very name would become shorthand for suffering, cruelty, and state-sanctioned terror. To understand Dachau is to understand the origins of the Nazi concentration camp network. This chapter begins by exploring why this camp, above all others, became the birthplace of a system that transformed repression into a grim science. Dachau's importance lies not only in its longevity, but also in its role as the laboratory of Nazi repression. Opened in 1933, it operated for the entire 12 years of the Third Reich, from the earliest days of Hitler's dictatorship to the regime's collapse in 1945. During that time, it held more than 200,000 prisoners from over 30 nations, including political opponents, clergy, Jews, Romani people, and prisoners of war. Unlike extermination camps in Poland, Dachau was not designed primarily for mass gassing, but death was ever present in its walls. Thousands perished from starvation, disease, forced labor, executions, and medical experiments. The camp became both a prison and a training ground for SS guards, instilling them with cruelty that they later carried to other camps. Dachau was thus simultaneously a site of suffering for prisoners and a breeding ground of brutality for perpetrators. The camp's dual role as a model and a proving ground made it central to Nazi governance. Even those who never set foot inside its barbed wire knew its reputation, for the word Dachau carried fear throughout Germany. Its history reflects the intersection of ideology, repression, and bureaucratic efficiency in the Nazi state. The establishment of Dachau was a direct response to the political and social turbulence of early 1933. After Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, the Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act gave the Nazis sweeping powers to silence opposition. Communist and social democratic leaders were among the first targets, rounded up in large numbers and sent to ad hoc detention centers run by the SA. But the disorder of these makeshift facilities embarrassed the new regime, which wanted to cloak repression in a veneer of legality. Heinrich Himmler, then head of the Bavarian police, proposed Dachau as a centralized camp where political enemies could be confined under official authority. By presenting it as a necessary measure for state security, the Nazis framed Dachau as a legitimate institution rather than an instrument of terror. This propaganda disguised its true function as a laboratory for intimidation and cruelty. Early reports in Nazi newspapers portrayed the camp as orderly, clean, and necessary, in stark contrast to the brutal reality within. In truth, Dachau was designed to instill fear in all who opposed Hitler's vision. Its founding represented the merging of ideology and infrastructure, turning repression into permanent policy. From the very beginning, Dachau set precedents that would define the Nazi camp system. Its barbed wire, watchtowers, and rigid discipline were meant not only to confine bodies, but also to break spirits. The rules enforced by Theodor Eicke emphasized absolute obedience, humiliation, and punishment for even the smallest infractions. Prisoners were subjected to roll calls that lasted for hours in the bitter cold or sweltering heat. They were forced into exhausting labor on little food, constantly beaten and insulted by guards. This climate of fear created an atmosphere where survival depended on submission, resourcefulness, and luck. At the same time, Dachau was portrayed by the Nazis as a re-education facility where enemies of the state could supposedly be transformed into loyal citizens. This contradiction between official narrative and lived reality was a hallmark of Nazi governance. Dachau was in essence a stage upon which Nazi ideology was acted out daily. By enforcing terror in a structured environment, the regime demonstrated how power could be maintained through fear. This model would soon spread across Europe, replicated in camps from Buchenwald to Auschwitz. The symbolic importance of Dachau extended beyond its barbed wire fences. In Nazi Germany, the mere threat of being sent to Dachau was enough to silence dissent. It functioned not only as a prison, but also as a psychological weapon wielded against the German population. Ordinary citizens whispered about it. Political opponents feared it, and even those who supported the regime understood its chilling message. The camp made terror visible and tangible, reminding everyone that disobedience had consequences. Dachau's name became synonymous with disappearance, suffering, and humiliation. Yet paradoxically, some Germans believed Nazi propaganda and viewed Dachau as a place where dangerous radicals were justly contained. This tension between perception and reality reveals how repression operated through both fear and deception. By existing in plain sight, Dachau normalized the extraordinary violence of dictatorship. Its symbolism endured throughout the war, even as new camps eclipsed it in scale. To this day, the word Dachau carries an echo of dread, a reminder of how easily institutions can become tools of oppression. To fully appreciate Dachau's place in history, one must see it as both unique and representative. Unique, because it was the first permanent concentration camp, serving as the prototype for all others. Representative, because it embodied the core principles of Nazi repression, the dehumanization of enemies, the efficiency of bureaucracy, and the fusion of ideology with daily life. Within its walls, political opponents, religious leaders, Jews, Romani, and many others endured similar patterns of abuse. The diversity of its victims reflected the breadth of Nazi hostility, which expanded over time to encompass anyone deemed undesirable. At the same time, Dachau trained thousands of SS guards who carried their lessons of cruelty to new camps across Europe. It became a hub, radiating terror outward through both its prisoners and its perpetrators. Thus, Dachau was more than a single site of suffering. It was the seed of a vast network of camps. Its influence cannot be overstated. For the atrocities perfected there became templates for genocide. Dachau was both the beginning and the continuing symbol of the Nazi concentration camp system. The history of Dachau is inseparable from the history of Nazi Germany itself. From 1933 until 1945, the camp mirrored the shifting priorities of the regime. In the early years, it focused on political opponents, as Hitler consolidated power. Later it absorbed Jews, Romani, clergy, and prisoners of war as Nazi ambitions expanded. By the end it was overflowing with captives, serving as a microcosm of the war's human devastation. Each phase of Dachau's evolution reflected a stage in the radicalization of Nazi policy. Its longevity allowed it to adapt, grow, and absorb new functions as the Reich demanded. This adaptability made it one of the most important camps to study, for within its history lies the trajectory of the regime itself. From repression to persecution, from imprisonment to forced labor, Dachau captured the full spectrum of Nazi cruelty. Understanding Dachau is therefore essential to understanding the machinery of the Third Reich. It was not just a camp, it was a mirror held up to dictatorship. As this documentary unfolds, Dachau will serve as both a case study and a warning. We will explore its creation, its victims, its perpetrators, and its role as a training ground for wider atrocities. We will trace the lives lost, the suffering endured, and the ways in which cruelty was systematized into daily routine. Dachau will be examined not only as a physical place, but also as a symbol of terror and oppression. Its history will remind us how ideology, bureaucracy, and obedience can converge to create mechanisms of unimaginable suffering. Yet it will also reveal moments of resilience, solidarity, and humanity among the prisoners who endured. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest places, courage and dignity could survive. Dachau's legacy continues today in its memorial site, where visitors confront the evidence of past crimes. By remembering Dachau, we confront the dangers of forgetting, and by exploring it in detail, we keep alive the memory of those who suffered within its walls. The rise of Adolf Hitler in January 1933 marked the beginning of a new era of repression in Germany. The political climate was charged with tension, uncertainty, and fear as the Weimar Republic collapsed under economic despair and political violence. Street battles between communists, social democrats, and Nazis had already primed the nation for authoritarian control. Within weeks of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, the Reichstag fire gave the Nazis the pretext they needed to crush opposition. The Enabling Act soon followed, granting the regime dictatorial powers and silencing the last remnants of parliamentary democracy. Political opponents, especially communists and social democrats, were immediately branded enemies of the state. The public atmosphere shifted rapidly, as dissent became not only dangerous, but also a potential death sentence. It was in this environment that the Nazis first envisioned a centralized system to detain and neutralize opposition. Improvised prisons and detention centers existed, but they lacked order and efficiency. A new model was required, one that could embody Nazi authority and serve as a warning to the entire population. The early years of Nazi rule were defined by the targeting of political enemies. Communists were arrested in large numbers, as the regime portrayed them as the masterminds of the Reichstag fire. Social democrats were also seen as a threat, accused of weakening the nation through liberalism and dissent. Trade unionists and labor leaders, who had once wielded considerable influence, were crushed with swift brutality. Many of these individuals were rounded up in mass arrests, often without formal charges or trials. Their fate was uncertain, for Germany had no established system to handle political prisoners on such a scale. Makeshift detention centers sprang up in factories, cellars, and abandoned buildings, often run by SA stormtroopers. These sites, however, were chaotic, violent, and poorly organized, damaging the Nazi image of order and control. Heinrich Himmler recognized the need for something more permanent and more centralized. He saw an opportunity to both repress enemies and present a facade of state legitimacy. Dachau would become the embodiment of this strategy. The decision to create Dachau was rooted in the Nazis' obsession with projecting authority. To them, the spectacle of power was as important as power itself. Scattered jails and ad hoc prisons failed to send the necessary message to society. A centralized camp, however, would stand as a visible symbol of the new regime's dominance. Located near Munich, a stronghold of Nazi support, Dachau was chosen for its proximity to both political symbolism and logistical convenience. The site could easily be monitored, supplied, and visited by officials eager to showcase Nazi efficiency. Himmler announced the camp publicly, presenting it as a measure to protect the German people from dangerous subversives. In reality, its purpose was far more sinister: to instill fear and establish a prototype for broader repression. By giving Dachau a veneer of legality, the Nazis disguised its brutal reality. The camp thus became a paradox, a tool of terror wrapped in bureaucratic justification. The roots of Nazi repression were not limited to politics, but extended deeply into ideology. Hitler and his followers viewed their enemies not merely as opponents, but as existential threats to the German nation. Communists represented the spectre of Bolshevism, which the Nazis believed would destroy European civilization. Social democrats embodied liberal weakness, blamed for the humiliation of Versailles and the failures of Weimar democracy. Jews were portrayed as the ultimate conspirators, allegedly controlling both capitalism and communism to Germany's detriment. In this worldview, repression was not a temporary measure, but a permanent necessity. Camps like Dachau were essential to neutralize these supposed dangers. They provided the infrastructure for ideology to be enforced by violence. By embedding hatred into policy, the Nazis turned prejudice into systematic persecution. Dachau was the first step in transforming these ideas into daily reality. The early prisoners of Dachau reflected this ideological priority. They were not criminals in the traditional sense, but rather those who dared to oppose Nazi authority. Communists, union leaders, and outspoken clergy were among the first to be marched through its gates. Their presence demonstrated that Dachau was designed to silence voices of dissent, not to rehabilitate lawbreakers. The camp thus blurred the line between law and terror, showing that legality was whatever the regime declared it to be. This was a radical departure from previous German traditions of justice, rooted in law and order. By criminalizing opposition itself, the Nazis ensured that no one could safely criticize the regime. Every arrest reinforced the message that political disagreement equaled treason. Dachau, as the model camp, became both the repository and the showcase of this new logic. It was the crucible in which repression was forged into a permanent institution. The role of Dachau as a prototype cannot be overstated. Its administrative structures, disciplinary codes, and architectural layout all became templates for future camps. Theodor Eicke, its commandant, codified strict rules that demanded total obedience and sanctioned brutal punishments. These regulations were later distributed across the entire concentration camp system, standardizing cruelty as policy. Guards trained at Dachau were indoctrinated into a culture of violence and dehumanization. They learned not only to control prisoners, but to view them as subhuman enemies. This training was exported, ensuring that every camp replicated Dachau's ethos. In this way, Dachau became the breeding ground of the concentration camp system. It institutionalized repression, turning brutality into an official profession. Through Dachau, the Nazis created an enduring machinery of terror that would spread across Europe. The broader significance of Dachau lay in its psychological impact on German society. News of its existence spread quickly, carried by rumor, propaganda, and fear. For ordinary citizens, the threat of being sent to Dachau loomed over everyday life. It became shorthand for disappearance, suffering, and silence. Those who whispered against the regime knew the risk of ending up behind its barbed wire. At the same time, Nazi propaganda painted the camp as a necessary tool of security. This dual narrative, fear on one side, legitimacy on the other, helped cement Nazi power. Dachau was thus both a hidden terror and a public warning. Its origins reveal how repression can be normalized when cloaked in official rhetoric. The camp was not just a prison, it was a performance of power. By examining the origins of Nazi repression, we see how Dachau became more than just a camp. It was the physical embodiment of a political climate defined by fear, hatred, and the destruction of dissent. The decision to build it reflected the Nazis' understanding that terror worked best when made visible. Dachau stood as a warning to opponents, a model for bureaucrats, and a training ground for perpetrators. It revealed the regime's willingness to fuse ideology with administration, creating a system that was both efficient and ruthless. The camp's early history reminds us how repression begins, not with mass killings, but with silencing, intimidation, and normalization. In its origins, Dachau carried the DNA of the entire concentration camp system, from political arrests to ideological indoctrination. It showcased how dictatorship consolidates its power. This chapter reminds us that the roots of repression are often planted in the soil of fear and uncertainty. Dachau was the seed from which the forest of Nazi terror grew. Dachau officially opened its gates on March 22, 1933, just weeks after Hitler consolidated power as Chancellor of Germany. The camp was established on the grounds of an abandoned munitions factory outside the Bavarian town of Dachau. Its creation was announced by Heinrich Himmler, then police president of Munich, who described it as the first concentration camp for political prisoners. At the time, this category referred primarily to communist social democrats, trade unionists, and outspoken critics of the Nazi regime. The camp's foundation marked a turning point in the transformation of political repression into state policy. Unlike makeshift prisons run by stormtroopers, Dachau was intended to function as an official institution of the new order. The opening was covered by the press, with the Nazis presenting it as a lawful and necessary step for national security. In reality, its purpose was to intimidate, humiliate, and terrorize dissenters into silence. Dachau became both a tool of political consolidation and a public warning. From its inception, it was designed to outlive the chaos of improvised repression. The appointment of Theodor Eicke as Commandant of Dachau in June 1933 shaped its destiny. A staunch Nazi loyalist, Eicke was given the task of transforming the camp into a model of order and discipline. He issued a strict disciplinary code, combining rigid military-style regulations with a culture of merciless brutality. Prisoners were subjected to roll calls that could last for hours, designed to break both body and spirit. Punishments were swift and severe, ranging from beatings to solitary confinement in dark cells. Eicke's regulations introduced the infamous concept that guards were untouchable, immune from punishment for any violence inflicted on prisoners. He established routines that emphasized humiliation, forcing inmates to march, salute, and perform exhausting drills. This system institutionalized cruelty as part of daily life, ensuring guards were trained in domination. Eicke's Dachau model was later adopted across the entire concentration camp network. Under his leadership, Dachau became the prototype of Nazi terror cloaked in administrative efficiency. From the very beginning, Dachau was portrayed by Nazi officials as a protective custody camp. This label masked its true nature by suggesting that detainees were held for the security of the state rather than as victims of persecution. The concept of protective custody bypassed judicial oversight, allowing the SS to arrest and imprison anyone without trial. This administrative sleight of hand gave Dachau a veneer of legality while removing all limits on Nazi authority. Thousands of individuals could now be detained indefinitely with a single order. The judiciary, cowed by Nazi intimidation, rarely questioned this abuse of power. Citizens quickly realized that legal rights had been rendered meaningless under the new regime. Fear of Dachau spread far beyond the camp itself, discouraging even minor acts of dissent. The camp thus served a dual purpose. It confined enemies and intimidated society into obedience. Dachau symbolized the death of law under dictatorship. The physical design of Dachau reflected its intended purpose. Surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and patrol paths, the camp projected an aura of total control. Wooden barracks housed prisoners in cramped, unsanitary conditions, fostering disease and exhaustion. Administrative buildings ensured that meticulous records were kept, illustrating the bureaucratic precision of Nazi repression. The site also included workshops where prisoners were forced into labor, creating the foundation for the later fusion of exploitation and incarceration. The camp's organization embodied the dual Nazi obsession with order and terror. Every element of its construction was designed to strip prisoners of individuality and reduce them to numbers. Surveillance was constant, with guards trained to detect even the smallest infraction. The architecture of Dachau was as much psychological as it was physical, instilling hopelessness and obedience. Its layout became the blueprint for camps built across the expanding Reich. Dachau was not improvised chaos, but calculated terror. The first wave of prisoners consisted largely of political opponents. Communists were the most prominent, followed by Social Democrats, trade unionists, and other leftist activists. The Nazis also included outspoken intellectuals, clergy critical of the regime, and journalists who refused to conform. These individuals were deliberately targeted, because they represented the backbone of opposition to Nazi power. Their imprisonment sent a clear message: dissent would no longer be tolerated in the new Germany. For many, Dachau was not simply a prison, but the end of a political career and a public identity. The humiliation of being branded an enemy of the state was as damaging as the physical abuse endured inside. Stories of arrests and deportations spread quickly, magnifying the fear that Dachau instilled. Families of prisoners often faced social ostracism and harassment. The early detainees became living symbols of the cost of defiance. The SS used Dachau as both a laboratory of repression and a training ground. Guards received indoctrination that emphasized absolute loyalty to the regime and contempt for prisoners. Brutality was not only tolerated, but actively encouraged, framed as an expression of strength and discipline. Eiche's strict system made guards feel empowered, immune from moral or legal consequences. The camp thus created a culture where violence became normalized and cruelty was routine. Young recruits were hardened by exposure to daily abuse, which stripped them of empathy. This indoctrination ensured that Dachau produced not just guards but perpetrators of systemic terror. Many of these men later went on to staff other camps, carrying with them the lessons of repression learned in Dachau. The camp was therefore not only a site of suffering, but also a factory for producing executioners of Nazi policy. The legacy of this training echoed across the entire Reich. The establishment of Dachau in 1933 also marked a turning point in Nazi propaganda. Himmler and other officials presented the camp as a necessary tool for purging Germany of enemies within. Newspapers carried carefully crafted stories emphasizing order and discipline, omitting the reality of brutality. Visitors from state institutions were shown sanitized tours where barracks were cleaned and prisoners forced into neat lines. In this staged theater, Dachau appeared as a corrective institution rather than a site of terror. The propaganda was effective, persuading many ordinary Germans that the regime was simply restoring stability. Yet whispers of cruelty leaked out, creating an atmosphere of both denial and fear. The dual image of Dachau as a place of lawfulness to outsiders and a hell of repression to prisoners became a hallmark of Nazi deceit. This manipulation of public perception allowed the camp to operate largely unchallenged. Dachau's very existence demonstrated the success of propaganda in legitimizing tyranny. By the end of 1933, Dachau had already evolved beyond its original purpose. What began as a detention site for political opponents had become an instrument of state control. Its organization, rules, and brutality were systematically refined and institutionalized. The camp was no longer merely reactive but proactive, designed to anticipate and crush any form of resistance. It stood as both a physical structure and a psychological weapon aimed at the German population. Dachau embodied the fusion of ideology, bureaucracy, and violence that defined the Nazi regime. It symbolized the beginning of a system that would expand to encompass millions of victims across Europe. Theodor Eiche's model ensured that Dachau was not an isolated experiment, but the foundation of a vast network of camps. In this way, Dachau's establishment was both the start of countless tragedies and a warning of the horrors to come. Its gates opened onto a new era of organized terror. The first men to walk through Dachau's gates in 1933 were not criminals but political opponents. They were communists, social democrats, trade union leaders, and outspoken critics who had dared resist Hitler's seizure of power. Many were arrested in the days following the Reichstag fire, accused without evidence of plotting against the state. These individuals had been the backbone of Weimar Germany's political system, its debates, and its fragile democracy. In Dachau, they became symbols of what it meant to oppose Nazism in its infancy. Their uniforms, speeches, and intellectual confidence were stripped away as they were forced into prisoner garb. The shock of their fall from political podiums to wooden bunks was immense and humiliating. Dachau's purpose was clear from their treatment: to destroy the old political order, one captive at a time. Brutality was combined with the message that resistance to the Reich was futile. In these men's suffering, the foundations of Nazi terror were laid. Communists were the largest group among the first prisoners, reflecting Nazi obsession with destroying Marxism. They had long been Hitler's ideological enemies, accused of conspiring with Jews to undermine the nation. At Dachau they were subjected to particularly harsh treatment, often singled out for beatings and forced labor. SS guards mocked their political slogans and forced them into demeaning tasks designed to strip away dignity. Some were forced to scrub floors with toothbrushes, while others endured hours of roll calls in punishing weather. The goal was not only to punish, but to humiliate them into submission. Yet despite cruelty, these communists tried to maintain solidarity, whispering encouragement to one another. They taught songs and slogans in hushed voices, preserving fragments of their political identity. Their presence kept alive a fragile sense of defiance within the camp's walls. In their survival strategies, they planted seeds of resistance that would echo through Dachau's history. Social Democrats, though smaller in number, carried with them the memory of a different Germany. They were politicians, journalists, and activists who had opposed Hitler through democratic channels. For the Nazis, their crime was believing in parliamentary debate rather than dictatorship. Inside Dachau, they were stripped of their voices, their pens replaced by shovels and whips. Guards often ridiculed them as talkers unable to withstand real struggle, using violence to prove their supposed weakness. These men suffered deeply as their belief in civil society collided with the brutal machinery of the SS. Many were older than the communists, and found forced labor especially punishing. Still, their sense of civic responsibility often led them to support weaker prisoners. Quietly, they formed bonds across party lines, learning that survival required unity beyond ideology. In this way, Dachau forced former political rivals into reluctant comradeship. Intellectuals and professionals soon joined the prisoner ranks, adding another layer to Dachau's early population. These included teachers, lawyers, artists, and scientists who had criticized the Nazis or simply represented independent thought. For Hitler's regime, such men were dangerous because they shaped ideas and opinions. Their removal was an assault on the very possibility of critical thinking in Germany. Inside Dachau, they endured humiliations designed to mock their education and social standing. Professors were ordered to clean latrines, while doctors were beaten for offering medical advice. The Nazis sought to crush their dignity by forcing them into meaningless, degrading labor. Yet intellectuals sometimes found ways to preserve their identity, writing secret notes or teaching languages to fellow inmates. Their presence proved that no corner of society was safe from repression. Dachau was as much a prison for the mind as it was for the body. Among the earliest prisoners were clergy, especially Catholic priests, who had spoken against Nazi policies. These men represented moral authority outside the state, which the regime sought to silence. Many had preached sermons condemning violence, persecution, or the erosion of religious freedoms. Arrested without trial, they were thrown into Dachau alongside political radicals. Their cassocks were replaced with striped uniforms, erasing outward signs of spiritual identity. Yet faith often remained a source of strength for them within the camp's walls. Some continued to pray quietly, offering comfort to fellow inmates in hushed whispers. Guards mocked their religion, forcing priests into humiliating tasks meant to ridicule their vocation. Despite this, the presence of clergy introduced a moral dimension to prisoner solidarity. For many, their endurance offered hope in a place designed to extinguish it. Life for these early prisoners was marked by routines of exhaustion and terror. Days began with roll calls at dawn, where prisoners stood for hours in freezing or sweltering conditions. Work assignments followed, ranging from cleaning latrines to breaking rocks in nearby quarries. Food was meager, consisting of watery soup and a piece of bread, never enough to sustain the body. Medical care was virtually non-existent, with injuries often left untreated. Guards enforced discipline with fists, whips, and rifle butts, their violence constant and unpredictable. Prisoners quickly learned that survival required silence, obedience, and endurance. Yet in the shadows of brutality, tiny acts of defiance emerged, sharing a crust of bread, offering a whispered word of encouragement, or resisting despair became quiet rebellions. In these moments, humanity clung stubbornly to life inside Dachau's fences. The psychological impact of imprisonment was as severe as the physical toll. Men who had once spoken boldly in Parliament or preached from pulpits now lived under the constant threat of a guard's whip. Stripped of their names, they were reduced to numbers, a deliberate attempt to erase identity. The endless monotony of labor, humiliation, and roll calls bred despair. Many wrestled with the shame of feeling powerless against their captors, yet some clung to ideology or faith as shields against psychological collapse. Communists repeated slogans of resistance, while priests whispered prayers under their breath. Intellectuals debated history or literature in stolen moments, preserving fragments of culture in the darkness. Such mental resistance kept alive the notion that the Nazis could not fully conquer the human spirit. Dachau's early prisoners became examples of resilience in the face of calculated dehumanization. By the end of Dachau's first year, thousands had already passed through its gates. The mix of communists, social democrats, intellectuals, and clergy reflected the regime's determination to crush every source of opposition. Each group suffered in its own way, yet all shared the common fate of Dachau's terror. Their experiences revealed how the camp functioned not only as a prison, but as a symbol of Nazi domination. Fear of Dachau extended beyond its fences, warning ordinary Germans that dissent would lead here. The SS refined its methods, turning brutality into routine and humiliation into policy. Dachau thus became both a laboratory of repression and a model for camps to come. The suffering of these early prisoners was the foundation upon which a vast machinery of persecution would be built. Their broken bodies and unyielding spirits told the story of resistance crushed but not extinguished. In Dachau's infancy, the seeds of future horrors were sown. The organization of Dachau was no accident but a meticulously designed system of repression. At its head stood the SS, Heinrich Himmler's elite force, tasked with transforming ideology into practice. The camp was divided into two spheres, the prisoner compound and the SS administrative zone. Guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles and dogs, projecting an atmosphere of omnipresent danger. Within the camp, order was maintained not by chance but through strict regulations, roll calls, and calculated terror. Each section of Dachau was designed to serve a function, from barracks to workshops to punishment blocks. The SS sought not merely to confine, but to control every aspect of prisoner life. Rules governed when inmates could eat, march, or even relieve themselves. Deviation from the smallest regulation resulted in severe punishment. This bureaucratic precision made Dachau a prototype for the wider camp system that followed. The role of the commandant was central to Dachau's functioning. Men such as Theodor Eicke, who established the camp's framework, were both administrators and enforcers of ideology. They issued directives shaping every detail of daily life, from food rations to execution procedures. Commandants were supported by a staff of SS officers who managed specialized areas such as labor, medical services, and punishment. Beneath them, ordinary guards carried out orders with brutal efficiency. The hierarchy ensured that cruelty flowed downward, from commandant to prisoner, without hesitation or ambiguity. Orders were documented in meticulous detail, reflecting the German obsession with bureaucracy. Even the scheduling of beatings or executions was entered into official records. This administrative system cloaked atrocities in the language of paperwork and duty. Dachau thus became a place where bureaucracy and brutality merged seamlessly. The culture of the SS guards was one of absolute authority and indoctrination. Many were young men, trained to believe they were the racial elite enforcing Hitler's vision. Their daily routines emphasized discipline, obedience, and contempt for prisoners. Guards were taught to see inmates not as humans but as enemies of the Reich. Alcohol, camaraderie, and a sense of power reinforced their brutality. Over time, many guards grew desensitized to violence, treating cruelty as ordinary duty. The SS created an environment where empathy was punished and ruthlessness rewarded. Promotions often depended on the guards' willingness to execute orders without hesitation. The result was a subculture where sadism became normalized. Dachau's reputation as a place of terror was built upon this carefully nurtured guard mentality. At the heart of Dachau's organization was the system of regulations imposed on prisoners. Every movement was governed by rules designed to break individuality and enforce submission. Prisoners marched in step, saluted guards, and responded instantly to commands. Roll calls could last for hours, with men collapsing from exhaustion or exposure. Infractions as minor as looking at a guard the wrong way invited severe beatings. Work assignments were given not for productivity, but to inflict maximum suffering. These regulations stripped inmates of autonomy, forcing them into mechanical obedience. The rules extended even into the night, with strict curfews and inspections of barracks. Prisoners quickly learned that survival meant navigating this minefield of regulations. In Dachau, order became another weapon of oppression. Dachau also relied heavily on prisoner functionaries, known as kapos, who enforced SS regulations. These prisoners, often criminals, were given privileges in exchange for maintaining discipline among their peers. Kapos supervised work details, distributed rations, and punished disobedience. The system created divisions among inmates, sowing mistrust and resentment. For the SS, this method allowed control with fewer guards, while making prisoners complicit in their own suffering. Some kapos were notoriously brutal, using their power to exploit fellow captives. Others, however, quietly resisted, offering small acts of kindness when possible. This duality revealed the complexity of survival within Dachau's hierarchy. The kapos system blurred the line between victim and perpetrator. It ensured that cruelty permeated even the relationships among prisoners themselves. Behind Dachau's operations lay the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office. This bureaucratic branch linked the camp to the broader machinery of the Third Reich. It ensured that forced labor, punishments, and even executions were documented, categorized, and reported. Ledgers recorded how many prisoners worked in quarries, how many fell ill, and how many died. The language of efficiency masked the reality of human suffering. By reducing people to numbers, the SS justified cruelty as administrative necessity. Economic exploitation became inseparable from repression, with every action serving the war machine. Bureaucrats sitting far from Dachau approved policies that dictated daily misery. Their signatures translated into hunger, disease, and death within the barbed wire. The camp structure was thus both local and national, merging terror with paperwork. Central to SS organization was the principle of dehumanization. By enforcing strict hierarchies and reducing prisoners to numbers, the SS ensured individuals vanished into categories. This system eliminated moral dilemmas for guards and administrators alike. Violence was not personal but institutional, carried out because orders demanded it. Uniforms, drills, and rituals reinforced the SS identity, shielding individuals from personal responsibility. Bureaucratic detachment allowed atrocities to be committed with frightening normalcy. Guards filled out forms after executions as if logging factory output. Orders were obeyed without question, because disobedience meant dishonor or punishment. Dachau was not chaos, but carefully engineered order where cruelty was efficient and systematic. The SS organization demonstrated how ideology fused with administration to produce industrialized oppression. By 1939, Dachau's SS structure had become the model for the entire concentration camp system. Other camps adopted its hierarchies, regulations, and reliance on prisoner functionaries. Theodor Eicke's blueprint spread across occupied Europe, turning localized terror into a continent-wide system. Dachau's organization revealed how cruelty could be industrialized through bureaucracy. Its commandants, guards, and administrative officers transformed ideology into lived reality. The camp was not simply a prison but a machine of repression, finely tuned by SS efficiency. Every regulation, report, and patrol reinforced the Nazi vision of total control. In this sense, Dachau was both unique and universal, unique as the first, universal as the prototype. Its structure foreshadowed the horrors of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and beyond. Dachau's SS system left behind a chilling legacy of organized cruelty. Life behind the barbed wire at Dachau was defined by relentless routine designed to crush individuality. Prisoners were awakened before dawn by harsh whistles or blows from guards, regardless of weather or health. Immediately, they were forced to rush outside for roll call, often standing motionless for hours in freezing cold or blistering heat. The SS used these roll calls to assert dominance, reading names, issuing punishments, and sometimes executing prisoners as warnings. Men collapsed from exhaustion or illness, yet were beaten back to their feet. Survival depended not only on physical endurance, but also on navigating this daily ritual of humiliation. The guards relished in stretching roll calls deliberately, forcing thousands to suffer prolonged agony. Even the simple act of standing became a weapon of control. By the time the roll call ended, many were already broken in body and spirit. This ritual was repeated every morning and evening without fail, a symbol of absolute SS power. After roll call, prisoners were marched in formation to labor assignments, their steps dictated by shouted commands. Work details ranged from quarrying stone, building roads, and digging ditches to tasks within SS workshops and factories. Labor was brutal, deliberately designed to exhaust rather than to be productive. Prisoners carried heavy loads for endless hours, often collapsing from hunger and fatigue. Guards patrolled with whips and rifles, striking anyone who slowed or stumbled. Death through overwork was a common reality, a policy later known as extermination through labor. Skilled workers sometimes received less punishing assignments, but even they endured long hours under constant threat. Inmates quickly learned that survival required conserving energy, collaborating when possible, and enduring humiliation silently. Work assignments were both physical torture and psychological degradation. Each day was an assault on body and soul, with no relief in sight. The diet in Dachau was deliberately insufficient, a starvation regime masked as sustenance. Morning rations consisted of thin, watery coffee, substitute with little nutritional value. Lunch was typically a soup of turnips, cabbage, or other scraps, often contaminated and barely edible. In the evening, prisoners received a crust of stale bread, sometimes accompanied by a smear of margarine or sausage substitute. Caloric intake rarely exceeded subsistence level, leaving men weak, emaciated, and vulnerable to disease. Starvation gnawed constantly, driving some to steal or barter for crumbs, despite severe punishments. Malnutrition produced swollen bellies, sunken cheeks, and the hollow-eyed look common to survivors. The deliberate policy was not only to weaken but to dehumanize, reducing prisoners to skeletal shells of their former selves. Hunger was as much a weapon as bullets or whips. Each meal reminded inmates that survival was a privilege, not a guarantee. Overcrowding intensified every hardship inside Dachau. Barracks designed for 200 inmates often housed over 1,600 during the height of the war. Prisoners slept packed tightly on wooden planks, stacked in bunks with no mattresses, straw, or blankets. The stench of sweat, disease, and unwashed bodies permeated every corner. Vermin infested the barracks, spreading lice and typhus. Privacy was non-existent, with communal latrines and washrooms offering no dignity. Illness spread rapidly in such conditions, and medical neglect ensured minor ailments became life-threatening. Guards ignored or mocked pleas for help, reinforcing the sense of helplessness. For many, nights were more dreadful than days, filled with coughing, groaning, and the constant fear of sudden beatings. Overcrowding turned Dachau into a breeding ground of misery, amplifying suffering at every level. The physical environment itself became a tool of oppression. Punishments were a daily reality, ensuring prisoners lived in constant fear. Infractions as minor as speaking without permission or failing to salute a guard invited harsh retribution. Beatings were delivered with clubs, rifle butts, or whips until victims were unconscious. Public hangings were staged to terrify inmates into submission. Special punishment cells subjected men to darkness, isolation, and starvation diets. Some were forced to stand at attention for days, collapsing repeatedly until death claimed them. Others endured tree hangings, suspended by their arms until shoulders dislocated. Punishment was not random but systematized, intended to reinforce the camp's total control. Prisoners never knew when violence would erupt, and this unpredictability deepened psychological torment. Fear itself became a permanent companion, shaping every movement and word within the barbed wire. Despite constant suffering, prisoners developed coping mechanisms to endure Dachau's brutality. Some clung to faith, whispering prayers under their breath during roll calls or labor. Others relied on solidarity, sharing crumbs of bread or offering a kind word that could mean the difference between despair and hope. Intellectuals recited poetry or taught languages in hushed voices, preserving a spark of humanity. Small acts of defiance, like smuggling scraps of paper or sabotaging work tools, gave a sense of agency. Humor, even dark or bitter, helped inmates resist complete psychological collapse. Survival often depended on finding meaning in endurance, no matter how grim the circumstances. These coping strategies allowed individuals to reclaim fragments of identity in a system designed to erase it. While the SS wielded absolute power, they could not fully extinguish the will to survive. Human resilience revealed itself even in Dachau's darkest corners. The psychological toll of daily life in Dachau was immense. Prisoners lived under constant uncertainty, never knowing if tomorrow would bring survival or death. This state of perpetual anxiety eroded mental health, driving many into despair. Depression, apathy, and hopelessness became as deadly as disease or starvation. Some inmates withdrew entirely, no longer responding to commands or acknowledging reality. Others experienced hallucinations or mental breakdowns, products of extreme stress and hunger. The SS exploited this fragility, using fear to break resistance and enforce obedience. Yet paradoxically, shared suffering also created bonds of solidarity that sustained some prisoners. The human mind became both battlefield and refuge in Dachau. Mental endurance was often the final barrier against complete annihilation. Ultimately, daily life behind Dachau's barbed wire was a carefully engineered system of dehumanization. Every element, roll calls, labor, starvation, punishments, and overcrowding, was designed to strip prisoners of dignity. Survival required navigating rules, forging alliances, and enduring constant abuse. Yet even within this machinery of terror, sparks of humanity persisted. Prisoners sang quietly, prayed secretly, or shared the smallest comforts with one another. These moments stood in stark contrast to the SS goal of total domination. The rhythms of suffering at Dachau became the rhythms of resistance, however fragile. Each day was both an ordeal and a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Dachau was not just a camp. It was a factory of despair, yet within it, survival itself became an act of defiance against tyranny. As the years progressed, Dachau expanded beyond its initial role as a camp for political opponents, transforming into the very blueprint for the Nazi concentration camp system. The SS recognized early on that Dachau was not just a place of imprisonment, but a laboratory of terror where methods of control could be tested and refined. Barracks multiplied, fences extended, and administrative offices grew in sophistication, reflecting the camp's increasing centrality to Nazi repression. Each structural change was accompanied by stricter regulations, codifying brutality into daily operations. The camp became not only larger, but more efficient, integrating bureaucratic precision with violence. By the late 1930s, Dachau housed thousands of prisoners from diverse backgrounds, symbolizing its growing importance. Expansion meant not just physical enlargement, but also ideological evolution, embedding Dachau into the machinery of the Third Reich. Its walls stood as proof that repression was no longer ad hoc but institutionalized. Dachau was evolving from a prison into an empire of suffering. This metamorphosis marked a pivotal stage in the Nazi system of control. Theodor Eicke, the commandant who had reorganized Dachau, played a central role in shaping its expansion. He envisioned the camp as both a site of punishment and a training ground for SS men, where cruelty was institutionalized as discipline. Under his guidance, Dachau became the model camp that future installations across occupied Europe would imitate. SS officers were rotated through Dachau, learning methods of surveillance, punishment, and psychological domination. What began as local brutality soon evolved into a codified doctrine of terror, exported to places like Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and later Auschwitz. Guards trained at Dachau were instructed to see prisoners as enemies of the Reich rather than human beings. They learned to administer beatings, enforce starvation, and carry out executions with mechanical detachment. This training model ensured consistency in cruelty across the growing camp network. Eicke's vision turned Dachau into the schoolhouse of SS brutality. Through Dachau, terror was standardized as official policy. The expansion of Dachau also reflected the shifting priorities of the Nazi regime. Initially focused on political enemies such as communists and social democrats, the camp soon became a holding site for Jews, clergy, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, and eventually foreign prisoners of war. This diversification of prisoners mirrored the broadening sweep of Nazi ideology, which sought to cleanse society of all undesirables. Administrative categories proliferated, each marked by colored triangles sewn on uniforms to indicate a prisoner's status. With each new group, Dachau's role expanded from punishment to social engineering, reinforcing the Nazi worldview. The camp became a microcosm of the Reich's vision, where hierarchies were enforced through violence and segregation. Prisoners were pitted against one another to break solidarity. Expansion was thus not only physical but symbolic, embodying the regime's widening net of persecution. Dachau evolved into a laboratory of Nazi ideology in action. In its growth, the camp mirrored the ambitions of Hitler's state. Physical expansion brought with it new facilities designed to maximize exploitation. Workshops were built where prisoners were forced into grueling labor, crafting goods for the SS and producing materials for the war machine. Brickworks, armament production, and tailoring shops became integral parts of the camp economy. Expansion into satellite camps meant prisoners were increasingly sent out to work in construction, agriculture, and industry. The boundaries of Dachau stretched far beyond its original fences, linking it to the wider Nazi economy. Labor was no longer incidental but central, with Dachau serving as a hub of forced productivity. This evolution made the camp both a place of death and a place of profit. Expansion tied Dachau to German companies and industries, cementing its role in the exploitation of human lives. In every sense, Dachau's growth was both physical and economic. The camp became inseparable from the Reich's system of conquest and oppression. As Dachau expanded, it also refined its mechanisms of control and surveillance. Guard towers multiplied, patrols increased, and an intricate system of informers and prisoner functionaries ensured compliance. The SS introduced stricter roll calls, harsher punishments, and collective penalties to instill fear. Every attempt at resistance was met with swift retaliation, reinforcing the sense of total domination. Expansion meant more prisoners, but it also meant more rules designed to fragment and suppress them. The SS perfected psychological control by fostering mistrust, appointing prisoners as capos to enforce discipline. This structure created a hierarchy within suffering, ensuring the SS maintained absolute authority with minimal effort. The evolving system emphasized efficiency, cruelty, and the erasure of individuality. Expansion was not just about numbers, but about perfecting a machine of obedience. Dachau's evolution made it a prototype for mechanized terror. Dachau's growth was also symbolic in the Nazi propaganda narrative. The regime presented the camp as a model of order, discipline, and justice, contrasting it with the supposed chaos of Weimar Germany. Official visitors were carefully guided through sanitized areas, shielded from the brutal reality of daily life. Expansion allowed for staged displays of re-education and rehabilitation, masking the true purpose of the camp. In reality, the camp was a factory of suffering, but propaganda portrayed it as a necessary tool of national renewal. This dual identity, model for the world, nightmare for its prisoners, was central to Dachau's evolution. The camp's very existence reinforced the myth of Nazi efficiency and resolve. Expansion thus had a political dimension, legitimizing repression as statecraft. Through Dachau, the regime broadcast its vision of order to Germany and the world. The camp became both symbol and substance of Nazi power. The expansion of Dachau did not only affect prisoners but also shaped the SS culture itself. Training programs hardened recruits, indoctrinating them into the ideology of racial superiority and unquestioning obedience. Guards were taught to suppress empathy, viewing brutality as loyalty to the Reich. The camp became a proving ground where men demonstrated their capacity for violence and commitment to Nazi ideals. Those who excelled were promoted and sent to command other camps, spreading Dachau's legacy of cruelty. Expansion thus ensured the replication of terror far beyond Bavaria. The SS culture that emerged from Dachau glorified hardness, efficiency, and mercilessness. For many guards, Dachau was where they shed their humanity in service of ideology. Expansion produced not only a larger camp but a larger cadre of men trained in systematic dehumanization. The camp's evolution shaped both victims and perpetrators. In Dachau, brutality was institutionalized as duty. By the outbreak of the Second World War, Dachau had fully evolved into the model and training ground for the entire concentration camp system. Its physical growth, administrative sophistication, and ideological clarity made it the prototype for dozens of camps that followed. The brutality perfected at Dachau would echo in Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz. Expansion gave Dachau a dual identity. It was both a prison for thousands and a blueprint for millions more to come. Every new camp bore the mark of Dachau's methods and structures. The evolution of Dachau from an improvised holding site to a systematic instrument of oppression reflected the radicalization of the Nazi state. Its growth was not accidental but deliberate, a central feature of Hitler's vision of domination. Dachau's expansion foreshadowed the horrors yet to unfold across Europe. The camp's evolution was both a warning and a prototype. Through Dachau, the Reich perfected the machinery of human destruction. Among the many groups imprisoned within Dachau, one stood out as both unexpected and deeply symbolic: the clergy, Catholic priests, Protestant ministers, and members of other religious communities were confined within its walls, transforming the camp into a crucible of faith under oppression. By 1940, Dachau became the central holding site for religious prisoners in the Reich, with an entire section known as the priests' barracks. This designation made Dachau unique in the camp system, turning it into a repository of captured moral voices. The regime recognized that religious leaders held immense influence over communities, and by silencing them, the Nazis hoped to break resistance from the pulpit. Most prisoners were Catholic priests, many from Poland, though German, Austrian, French, and other nationalities were represented. Protestant clergy were fewer in number, but their presence reflected the regime's distrust of all independent moral authorities. Even Jehovah's Witnesses, persecuted for refusing military service, shared their suffering within Dachau. Religion, in all its forms, was viewed with suspicion by the Nazi state. At Dachau, faith was imprisoned alongside politics. The priests' barracks housed thousands over the course of the war, with Catholic clergy forming the overwhelming majority of the more than 2,700 priests sent to Dachau. Nearly 1,800 were Polish, reflecting Nazi hostility toward the Polish Church. These men were often targeted not for political activity, but for their role as community leaders, educators, and spiritual anchors. Many had resisted Germanization policies, defended parishioners, or were accused of harboring patriotic sentiment. Others were caught up simply for being part of the Polish intellectual and moral elite, which the Nazis sought to eradicate. The Polish clergy endured particularly brutal treatment, with harsher labor assignments and fewer privileges than German priests. Yet within the barracks, they continued to pray, celebrate clandestine mass, and support one another spiritually. Their suffering became a microcosm of the larger destruction of Polish cultural and religious life. To the Nazis, breaking the clergy was essential to breaking the people. To the prisoners, faith became the last unshakable fortress. German and Austrian priests also filled the barracks, though their experiences were shaped by different dynamics. Some had openly criticized Nazi policies, denouncing anti-Semitism, euthanasia, or state brutality from the pulpit. Others had been involved in underground networks, smuggling information, or protecting the persecuted. Even quiet resistance could be enough to bring them under suspicion, as the regime tolerated no independent moral authority. Protestant clergy, though fewer in number, often came from the confessing church, which opposed the Nazification of German Christianity. Figures like Pastor Martin Niemöller, who famously spoke against state interference in church affairs, exemplified the moral courage that landed many behind barbed wire. For these men, Dachau became the price of conscience. Their presence was a reminder that not all religious institutions were silent in the face of tyranny. In the priests' barracks, nationality and denomination blended into shared suffering. The camp became a grim ecumenical gathering, forged by persecution. The daily lives of religious prisoners bore both the hardships of Dachau and the unique weight of spiritual struggle. They endured starvation rations, brutal roll calls, and backbreaking labor alongside all other inmates. Yet they also bore the added humiliation of being singled out as moral authorities stripped of dignity. The Nazis mocked their faith, forcing priests into degrading tasks such as cleaning latrines or working in the most punishing details. Guards jeered during prayer and often punished those caught offering spiritual comfort to others. Yet within the barracks, faith did not vanish. It adapted, finding ways to survive. Secret masses were celebrated using smuggled bread and wine, whispered confessions were heard in corners, and prayers were murmured in defiance of SS orders. For many, spiritual life became a weapon of resilience against despair. Dachau became a battlefield between the will to destroy faith and the determination to preserve it. Religion, under barbed wire, became an act of rebellion. The priests' barracks gained a reputation among inmates as a place of both suffering and solace. While clergy endured the same cruelty as others, their presence provided spiritual encouragement to fellow prisoners. Many priests offered last rites to the dying, buried the dead in dignity when possible, or simply whispered words of comfort. Protestant pastors led prayer circles, while Catholic priests organized clandestine rosaries and devotions. For some prisoners, faith became a means of survival, a reminder that suffering had meaning even in the darkest hours. Yet the SS remained wary, monitoring these activities and punishing any open displays of religion. Guards sometimes forced priests to mock their own rituals, turning sacred rites into instruments of humiliation. Despite this, the barracks retained an atmosphere of fragile hope. Within its walls, Dachau's victims clung to the belief that spirit could not be broken. Religion became the invisible resistance, sustaining both body and soul. The mortality rate among religious prisoners was staggering, particularly among Polish clergy. Starvation, disease, beatings, and executions claimed thousands, with epidemics like typhus spreading rapidly in the overcrowded barracks. Some were deliberately sent to the infirmary for lethal injections, while others perished in medical experiments. Yet records also reveal extraordinary acts of self-sacrifice, as priests often gave up their food rations to younger inmates or ministered to the sick despite the risk of infection. Stories circulated of priests collapsing from exhaustion while praying aloud, refusing to abandon their spiritual duties. For many, martyrdom was not sudden, but gradual, unfolding through daily sacrifices in the face of terror. These deaths were not merely statistics, but testimonies of faith confronted with annihilation. The Nazis intended Dachau to destroy the moral backbone of communities. Instead, it became a place where faith often revealed its deepest strength. Death could silence voices, but not their witness. Among the clergy imprisoned at Dachau, some names have since become symbols of resistance and faith. Father Karl Leisner, a German Catholic seminarian, was secretly ordained a priest within the camp, a rare moment of triumph amid despair. Polish priests such as Blessed Michał Kozał, who perished in Dachau, were later recognized for their martyrdom. Protestant pastors, though less numerous, also left a legacy of courage, with figures like Niemöller embodying defiance through imprisonment. These stories illustrate how Dachau became both a place of annihilation and a forge of enduring moral testimony. Kolji, who survived, carried lifelong scars, but also bore witness to the indomitable power of belief. Their stories were recorded in post-war memoirs, sermons, and testimonies, ensuring that the memory of faith under fire was preserved. Dachau's priests' barracks was not simply a prison, but a chapter in religious history. In it, sacred traditions confronted the machinery of terror. Faith, stripped to its core, endured. The existence of the priests' barracks at Dachau holds a unique place in the history of the camps. It symbolizes the regime's desire to crush every source of independent moral authority, while also revealing the resilience of faith under persecution. The presence of thousands of clergy demonstrated that religious institutions were not immune to repression, yet their survival, prayers, and sacrifices showed that the spirit could not be entirely extinguished. Dachau thus became both a graveyard of faith and a monument to its endurance. For the Nazi regime, it was a place to silence voices. For history, it became a place that amplified them. Today, the memory of Dachau's clergy stands as a reminder of the costs of conscience in times of tyranny. Their suffering illuminates the camp's broader story of dehumanization and resistance. The priests' barracks remain a testament to faith in the shadow of barbed wire. Religion tested in Dachau proved unbreakable. From the very beginning, Dachau was envisioned not only as a prison, but as a tool to crush political opposition to the Nazi regime. Its earliest inmates were communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and liberal intellectuals who represented the fractured democratic culture of Weimar Germany. For Hitler and Himmler, these men and women embodied the dangerous memory of freedom, pluralism, and political debate. Inside the camp, they were subjected to relentless intimidation, humiliation, and violence aimed at breaking both body and ideology. Guards singled them out for special punishments, often forcing them into exhausting work details or public beatings to serve as warnings. Yet, despite the cruelty, political prisoners carried within them a sense of shared identity and a duty to resist. Their presence gave Dachau a distinctive character in its early years, transforming it into both a site of terror and a crucible of clandestine defiance. The Nazis sought to silence dissent, but in many ways they unintentionally concentrated it in one place. These prisoners became the backbone of an underground spirit that refused to vanish. The barbed wire could hold their bodies, but not their ideals. Networks of political prisoners formed quietly, often beginning with whispered exchanges in overcrowded barracks. Former parliamentarians, union leaders, and journalists found one another in the chaos of roll calls and labor details. They established invisible hierarchies of mutual support, sharing smuggled food or information as acts of resistance. Even the smallest gesture, a shared crust of bread, a concealed note of encouragement, carried political significance, reinforcing solidarity against the Nazi attempt at atomization. Prisoners recited banned songs, quoted revolutionary literature, or retold stories of pre-Nazi political struggles to keep morale alive. Some kept secret diaries or tried to memorize names and experiences for future testimony, ensuring the truth could not be erased. The SS regarded these behaviors as subversive, cracking down brutally whenever traces of organized activity were discovered. But repression only deepened the determination of many prisoners to preserve their convictions. These invisible threads of resistance sustained countless men and women through years of dehumanization. In Dachau, even memory itself became an act of defiance. Secret communication was the lifeblood of political resistance inside the camp. Prisoners devised ingenious ways to exchange information under the watchful eyes of the SS. Messages were scratched into soap, hidden inside hollowed-out loaves of bread, or whispered during moments of labor when guards were distracted. Some inmates memorized news from whispered conversations with new arrivals, spreading updates about the outside world like wildfire within the blocks. Political prisoners frequently took on the dangerous task of writing tiny coded notes smuggled through trusted civilian workers, particularly those employed in nearby industries. When caught, these couriers faced savage beatings, solitary confinement, or execution, yet the flow of communication never ceased. Such secret exchanges not only sustained hope, but also kept alive the idea that the Nazi regime was not invincible. Information that the Allies were advancing, or that resistance movements were growing, became precious lifelines. Each word carried through the wire was a small victory against the machinery of silence. In Dachau, knowledge itself was a weapon. Acts of resistance often took subtle, symbolic forms rather than outright revolt. Political prisoners developed strategies of survival that doubled as quiet defiance, working deliberately slower than ordered, sabotaging equipment, or feigning illness to disrupt camp routines. These small gestures accumulated into a rhythm of refusal, a way of reminding themselves that they still possessed agency. At times, prisoners collaborated across political divisions, with communists, social democrats, and Catholics finding common ground in shared suffering. Their ability to cooperate in a place designed to destroy solidarity became itself a powerful form of rebellion. The camp's authorities feared these networks, knowing that political unity could undermine their control. As a result, informers and spies were planted among prisoners, sowing distrust and betrayal. Yet even betrayal did not eradicate the will to resist. Each act of sabotage, however small, undermined the camp's machinery of domination. Defiance in Dachau was a quiet flame, flickering yet unextinguished. Not all political resistance remained hidden, for there were moments of open defiance even under the threat of death. Prisoners occasionally refused orders en masse, risking collective punishment to protest unbearable conditions. Hunger strikes broke out, though they were met with ferocious reprisals, including denial of rations and brutal force feeding. In rare cases, groups of political inmates sang band anthems or raised their voices in solidarity when one of their own was publicly executed. These acts, though short-lived, carried immense psychological weight for both the participants and the witnesses. They reaffirmed that even under complete subjugation, the human spirit could not be entirely crushed. Guards sought to stamp out such demonstrations quickly, fearing their contagious power over the camp population. Yet each episode was remembered, whispered about long afterward, and added to the growing mythology of endurance. In this way, resistance became not just a tactic, but a memory passed between prisoners. Dachau was not only a site of suffering, but also a forge of courage. As the years progressed, Dachau drew prisoners from across occupied Europe, expanding the spectrum of political defiance within its walls. French resistors, Polish underground fighters, Yugoslav partisans, and even Soviet political commissars all found themselves crammed into the overcrowded barracks. Each brought stories of resistance outside the camp, inspiring those already inside with tales of sabotage, guerrilla fighting, and Allied advances. These international prisoners wove together a tapestry of defiance that transcended borders. In some cases, they even attempted to coordinate with external resistance movements, using smuggled notes or sympathetic civilian workers as intermediaries. Their cooperation revealed that Dachau was not an isolated world, but a node in the broader struggle against Nazi tyranny. The SS, recognizing the danger, increased surveillance and repression, but the seeds of solidarity had already been sown. Political prisoners continued to nurture these seeds, even when starvation and exhaustion threatened to extinguish them. For them, Dachau was both a cage and a battlefield of ideals. In the heart of darkness, they held fast to the promise of freedom. The price of political resistance was often death, and the SS ensured that punishment was public and terrifying. Prisoners caught smuggling messages, sabotaging equipment, or forming networks were hanged in front of their peers as warnings. Others were sent to the most lethal work details, laboring until collapse under impossible conditions. Torture chambers echoed with screams of men who refused to betray their comrades, their silence speaking louder than any confession. Yet the cruelty of these punishments only hardened the resolve of many survivors to carry on the struggle in whatever way they could. Stories of martyrs circulated among prisoners, whispered as legends of courage to inspire new acts of defiance. To resist in Dachau was to gamble daily with one's life, but to give up resistance was to lose one's humanity entirely. Even in their final moments, political prisoners often shouted words of freedom or sang revolutionary hymns, leaving behind echoes of defiance. Their courage created a spiritual counterweight to the SS reign of terror. In Dachau, death itself became a protest. In retrospect, the role of political prisoners in Dachau reveals the paradox of the Nazi system. By concentrating their opponents in one place, the regime inadvertently preserved a living archive of resistance traditions. These men and women, drawn from every corner of Europe, formed a hidden parliament of the oppressed. Their stories of clandestine organization, secret communication, and acts of defiance remind us that Dachau was not only a site of annihilation, but also of resilience. While thousands perished, their ideas and their courage endured, carried into the post-war world by survivors. Many former political prisoners went on to become witnesses, writers, and leaders in rebuilding Europe. Their testimony ensured that the memory of resistance within the camps would not fade into silence. Dachau, the prototype of terror, thus also became a crucible of political endurance. In its shadows, freedom found guardians who refused to be broken. Their defiance, carved into history, remains one of Dachau's most enduring legacies. From its earliest days, Dachau was more than a prison for political opponents. It was a testing ground for the racial ideology that defined the Nazi worldview. Jews, Romani, and others considered racially inferior by Nazi standards were targeted not only for imprisonment, but for systematic degradation. While Dachau never became a mass extermination camp on the scale of Auschwitz, it laid the blueprint for policies that would culminate in genocide. The camp's atmosphere of racial hatred was reinforced by propaganda lectures, guard indoctrination, and constant verbal assaults against prisoners. Jewish detainees were stripped of their rights immediately, subjected to harsher punishments, and often singled out for humiliating labor. Romani families were torn apart, their cultural traditions mocked and erased by force. These groups became early test subjects for the Nazi obsession with racial purity. The physical abuse, forced segregation, and deliberate starvation they endured revealed the regime's intent long before death factories were constructed. Dachau was, in essence, the first rehearsal stage for the broader Holocaust. Its barbed wire fences echoed with the cries of those persecuted, not for what they did, but for who they were. For Jews brought to Dachau, life was marked by extraordinary cruelty from the moment of arrival. Guards forced them into degrading rituals, such as shaving their heads, confiscating personal belongings, and assigning numbers to erase identity. Unlike some political prisoners who retained minimal privileges, Jews were often assigned the heaviest and most dangerous labor tasks. They carried bricks, hauled stones, and worked in quarries until exhaustion drove them to collapse. Beatings were administered with greater frequency, fueled by the SS obsession with punishing racial enemies. Many Jewish prisoners were forced to clean latrines with their bare hands, or endure public ridicule during roll calls. The cruelty was designed not only to break bodies, but to annihilate dignity and identity. These humiliations mirrored the broader Nazi goal of stripping Jews of humanity altogether. In Dachau's barracks, the Jewish experience became a microcosm of what would later expand into continent-wide annihilation. Even here, the seeds of the final solution were already visible. The Romani, labeled as asocials and gypsies in Nazi racial categories, faced similar persecution within Dachau. Entire families were rounded up, transported under brutal conditions, and confined in segregated sections of the camp. Once inside, they were treated with contempt and disdain by both guards and fellow inmates conditioned by Nazi propaganda. Romani prisoners were often denied access to Red Cross parcels, further isolating them from survival resources. Forced labor was their daily reality, with many subjected to exhausting agricultural projects, construction work, or menial tasks designed to degrade rather than sustain the camp's economy. Children were especially vulnerable, many dying from malnutrition, exposure, or untreated illnesses. The Nazi obsession with racial science made the Romani frequent subjects of anthropometric studies, where measurements of skulls and body proportions were recorded in the name of pseudoscience. These experiments stripped individuals of dignity, reducing them to specimens. In Dachau, Romani persecution foreshadowed the genocidal policies that culminated in mass extermination at Auschwitz-Birkenau and other camps. Their suffering at Dachau underscores the broader Nazi war against diversity and cultural existence. Beyond Jews and Romani, Dachau also became a prison for others considered undesirable by Nazi ideology. Homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and individuals with disabilities were incarcerated alongside political and racial prisoners. Each group bore a unique stigma, subjected to punishment specifically crafted to reflect their supposed degeneracy. Homosexual prisoners were marked with pink triangles and often selected for the harshest labor or medical experiments. Jehovah's Witnesses were punished for refusing to salute Hitler or serve in the Wehrmacht, their faith forcing them into direct confrontation with Nazi demands. People with disabilities, though more often sterilized or killed under the T4 euthanasia program, also appeared in Dachau as test subjects for medical atrocities. This expansion of targets demonstrated how racial persecution intertwined with ideological and cultural oppression. Dachau became a laboratory of Nazi cruelty where every deviation from the Aryan norm was criminalized. The camp thus mirrored the regime's vision of a purified society where exclusion was enforced with barbed wire, batons, and bullets. In Dachau, persecution knew no boundaries. Racial persecution at Dachau was reinforced by systematic segregation within the camp itself. Prisoners were classified with colored badges, ensuring that Jews, Romani, and others carried visible markers of their status at all times. These symbols invited constant abuse, with guards targeting those wearing yellow or black triangles for harsher treatment. In work details, Jews were deliberately overworked to the point of collapse, while Romani were often beaten simply for existing. Medical neglect further reinforced racial hierarchies, with some groups denied even the meager care available to others. In barracks, overcrowding ensured that disease spread rapidly among persecuted groups, accelerating mortality. The use of classification as a tool of oppression reflected the broader Nazi obsession with categorization and control. By turning human beings into color-coded objects, the SS normalized cruelty and dehumanization. For the victims, every visible triangle became both a stigma and a death sentence. In Dachau, labels were as lethal as weapons. Testimonies from survivors reveal the crushing psychological impact of racial persecution within Dachau. Jewish prisoners described constant fear of arbitrary beatings, selections for medical experiments, or sudden executions. Romani survivors spoke of being treated like animals, stripped of names and reduced to numbers in Nazi records. Many described the sense of invisibility, as if the world beyond Dachau had forgotten their existence entirely. This psychological torment compounded the physical suffering, leaving deep scars that endured long after liberation. Some prisoners attempted to preserve dignity by maintaining cultural practices in secret, whispering prayers, singing songs, or sharing stories. These quiet acts of remembrance became lifelines in a world designed to erase identity. The SS, however, responded to such gestures with swift brutality when discovered, punishing entire groups for a single act of defiance. Survivor accounts emphasize that persecution was not merely physical destruction, but a war on memory and culture itself. In Dachau, annihilation began with humiliation. The role of Dachau in racial persecution also extended beyond its fences, as it served as a model for later camps. Practices of segregation, forced labor, medical experimentation, and arbitrary executions developed at Dachau were exported to Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Majdanek. Commandants trained at Dachau went on to oversee other camps, carrying with them the methods of racial oppression perfected there. Thus, the brutality inflicted on Jews, Romani, and marginalized groups at Dachau was not an isolated atrocity, but the foundation of a system. By refining bureaucratic methods of racial control, the camp provided a template for industrialized genocide. The persecution at Dachau showed how ideology could be transformed into daily routines of cruelty. Every regulation, from rationing to roll calls, reinforced the idea that some lives were worth less than others. In this sense, Dachau was not only a prison, but also a school of genocide. Its lessons spread across Nazi Europe with devastating consequences. In reflecting on Dachau's role in racial persecution, we confront the camp's enduring symbolic weight. It was here that Nazi ideology first fused with institutional practice, targeting people not for their actions but for their very identities. Dachau became a warning of how quickly prejudice, once legitimized by the state, could spiral into systemic violence. The suffering of Jews, Romani, and countless others within its walls represents the beginning of a trajectory that ended in Auschwitz's gas chambers and the mass graves of Eastern Europe. Survivor testimonies remind us that each statistic was a life full of culture, memory, and human dignity erased by hate. The camp's legacy is therefore both historical and moral, urging vigilance against prejudice in all its forms. To understand Dachau is to understand how the machinery of genocide was first assembled. It is to see how ordinary institutions can be transformed into engines of destruction. Above all, it is to remember those who endured persecution simply for being who they were. From its inception, Dachau was not merely a place of detention, but also a site of economic exploitation. The Nazi regime quickly realized that the camp could serve as a reservoir of forced labor, extracting every ounce of strength from prisoners until death claimed them. Slave labor was framed as both punishment and contribution to the Reich's ambitions, cloaked in rhetoric of re-education, but driven by greed. Inmates were sent to work on armaments production, quarrying, and construction projects that fueled the Nazi war machine. Every task, from carrying heavy stones to assembling weapons, was deliberately designed to break the body and spirit. The SS leadership partnered with corporations that eagerly profited from cheap, expendable labor. Workdays stretched from dawn to dusk, with starvation diets ensuring that productivity came at the cost of survival. For many prisoners, labor itself became a slow form of execution. Dachau thus merged ideology with economics, proving that cruelty could be profitable. It was here that industry and genocide became indistinguishable. The stone quarries of Dachau stand as one of the earliest examples of labor used as a weapon of destruction. Prisoners were forced to haul massive rocks with primitive tools, their bodies straining under impossible loads. Guards took perverse pleasure in assigning tasks designed to ensure failure, punishing collapse with beatings or executions. The quarry became a place of torment where men carried boulders up and down steep inclines until exhaustion drove them to their deaths. This practice, known as extermination through labor, epitomized the Nazi belief that enemies of the state deserved no relief. Survivors later recalled the hopeless rhythm of endless carrying, where one misstep could result in a fatal blow. The quarry was both workplace and execution ground, a space where labor and death became one. Beyond breaking bodies, the work symbolized the stripping of individuality, reducing humans to beasts of burden. No productivity was expected, only suffering. In Dachau's quarries, cruelty was the only true product. As the war escalated, Dachau's role in armaments production became increasingly important. Workshops were established within and around the camp, where prisoners were compelled to manufacture weapons, ammunition, and equipment for the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. These facilities were often makeshift, with little regard for safety or humane conditions. Inmates worked in overcrowded halls with poor ventilation, inhaling toxic fumes and dust that slowly poisoned their lungs. Production quotas were enforced by brutality, with SS overseers striking or killing those who fell behind. Despite the degradation, the output from these workshops contributed directly to sustaining the German war effort. Many companies, eager for profit, established direct ties with Dachau, benefiting from the endless supply of disposable workers. For the prisoners, survival meant balancing exhaustion with the need to appear productive enough to avoid punishment. Even in these factories, starvation and disease claimed countless lives. The workshops at Dachau revealed how industry was built on suffering and silence. Corporate complicity was one of the most chilling aspects of Dachau's labor system. German industrial giants such as Siemens, Messerschmitt, and BMW relied heavily on prisoners to produce goods essential for the war. These corporations signed contracts with the SS, effectively renting human beings for exploitation. For the companies, the arrangement meant access to labor without wages, insurance, or concern for worker welfare. For the SS, it was a lucrative partnership that turned ideological persecution into financial profit. The presence of corporate engineers and supervisors inside Dachau workshops demonstrated that business leaders knew precisely what conditions existed. They witnessed starvation, exhaustion, and brutality, yet rarely intervened. Their silence enabled the machinery of forced labor to continue unchecked. In this fusion of capitalism and dictatorship, the suffering of prisoners was commodified. Dachau was not only a prison, but also a factory of profit for the Reich's corporate partners. In addition to armaments, prisoners were deployed on infrastructure and agricultural projects tied to the camp's operations. They dug trenches, repaired roads, and built new facilities intended to expand the camp's capacity. In agriculture, they worked on SS-owned farms, cultivating food that rarely reached their own plates. These projects exposed prisoners to the elements for long hours, leaving them vulnerable to heat stroke in summer and frostbite in winter. With rations already meager, physical exertion only accelerated the decline into starvation. Many collapsed in the fields or on construction sites, their bodies discarded without ceremony. Survivors later described the irony of growing food they would never taste and building structures they would never inhabit. Every task underscored the complete erasure of human dignity. To the SS, prisoners were nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. Forced labor in these projects blurred the line between punishment and annihilation. The philosophy of extermination through labor was central to Dachau's system of exploitation. This concept meant that labor was not intended to rehabilitate or sustain life, but to extinguish it slowly and systematically. Prisoners were pushed beyond physical limits, with malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion functioning as silent executioners. Guards maintained a calculated balance, keeping inmates alive just long enough to extract maximum labor before death. The cycle of replacement ensured a constant supply of bodies as new transports filled the void left by the dead. For those inside Dachau, the realization that work itself was a death sentence was inescapable. Every blow of a hammer or lift of a stone became part of a cruel countdown to collapse. Unlike executions, labor was designed to prolong suffering, making death a drawn-out inevitability. This system allowed the Nazis to disguise murder behind the guise of productivity. In reality, every project was built on bones and blood. Personal testimonies from survivors bring the horrors of Dachau's forced labor into sharp focus. Prisoners recalled the agony of marching to work details under armed guard, already weakened by hunger and disease. They spoke of trembling hands that could barely lift tools, of backs breaking under loads far too heavy for emaciated bodies. Many described the constant humiliation as guards mocked their weakness and punished the inevitable failures. For those in industrial workshops, the roar of machines and the stench of chemicals created an atmosphere of unending torment. Escape from this cycle was rare, as collapse usually meant death on the spot. Yet even in these conditions, moments of solidarity emerged. Inmates secretly shared scraps of bread, offered words of encouragement, or helped one another carry impossible burdens. These small acts of humanity became vital for survival. Survivor accounts ensure that the memory of forced labor is not reduced to statistics, but remains deeply human. Their voices remind us that behind every machine part or stone was a life sacrificed. Dachau's legacy, as a site of forced labor, continues to cast a shadow over history. It demonstrated how ideology, bureaucracy, and industry could converge to create a system where suffering became normalized and profitable. The camp served as a prototype for countless others, exporting its model of exploitation across Nazi-occupied Europe. Its connections with German corporations highlight the complicity of business in crimes against humanity. For the survivors, memories of labor's cruelty were lifelong scars, shaping testimonies that would later inform war crimes trials. The image of prisoners collapsing under stones or coughing in toxic workshops stands as a stark reminder of the cost of human life reduced to labor. Dachau teaches us that economic gain can become a mask for atrocity when ethics are abandoned. The forced labor system was not just an element of Dachau, it was its very heartbeat. To remember Dachau is to remember how human beings were worked to death in the name of profit and power. The story of labor at Dachau is thus central to the story of Nazi barbarism itself. Among the most notorious aspects of Dachau's history were the medical experiments conducted within its walls. Cloaked in the language of scientific inquiry, these experiments were in reality acts of calculated torture carried out under the guise of research. Prisoners, stripped of their rights and dignity, were treated as disposable test subjects by Nazi doctors and SS overseers. The experiments were justified as efforts to advance military medicine, yet they were driven as much by ideology and cruelty as by any scientific rationale. At Dachau, hypothermia trials, high-altitude studies, and pharmaceutical testing became routine horrors inflicted on captive bodies. Each experiment represented a deliberate assault on human life, reducing men and women to mere instruments of Nazi ambition. Victims were selected from camp populations without consent, chosen solely because they were deemed expendable. For the prisoners, participation meant agony and often death. What the Nazis called research was, in truth, a grotesque abuse of power. Dachau thus became not only a camp of labor and terror, but also a laboratory of suffering. The hypothermia experiments at Dachau were some of the most infamous in the camp's history. Conducted primarily between 1942 and 1943, these tests sought to discover methods of rewarming pilots who had crashed into the frigid waters of the North Sea. Prisoners were submerged in vats of icy water, their limbs restrained as doctors observed the slow onset of hypothermia. Victims shivered violently, lost consciousness, and frequently died under the unfeeling gaze of medical staff. Some were placed outdoors in freezing weather for extended periods, their suffering recorded with scientific precision. When methods of rewarming were tested, they ranged from warm baths to grotesque experiments involving body heat from female subjects forced into proximity with dying men. Survivors recalled the excruciating pain of numbness creeping through their bodies, followed by the despair of knowing they were human guinea pigs. Dozens perished, and those who lived bore permanent damage to their health. The hypothermia experiments epitomized the callous disregard for life that defined Nazi medical practice. They revealed how science was corrupted into a tool of cruelty. Another category of experimentation at Dachau involved high-altitude pressure chamber studies. These experiments, conducted in cooperation with the Luftwaffe, sought to simulate conditions faced by pilots ejecting at extreme altitudes. Prisoners were locked inside sealed chambers where air pressure was rapidly reduced, mimicking ascents to 20,000 meters. Victims writhed in agony as their bodies convulsed from lack of oxygen, some collapsing with burst blood vessels and bleeding from the ears and eyes. Many suffocated slowly while doctors recorded their responses with detached precision. Some prisoners were revived only to be subjected to the ordeal again, while others died outright within the chambers. Survivors described the unbearable pain of exploding lungs, crushing pressure in their skulls, and the terror of knowing they were being killed for data. These experiments killed hundreds and left behind medical reports that later horrified Allied investigators. The pressure chamber became one of Dachau's most infamous tools of destruction. It symbolized the fusion of military necessity with sadistic inhumanity. Pharmaceutical testing was another dark chapter of Dachau's medical abuse. Pharmaceutical companies, including some of Germany's largest firms, collaborated with the SS to test experimental drugs on prisoners. Inmates were deliberately infected with diseases such as malaria, typhus, and tuberculosis, left untreated until symptoms ravaged their bodies. At the height of their suffering, they were administered unproven treatments, whose effectiveness was measured only in terms of survival or death. The victims were never consulted, and their lives were deemed expendable in the pursuit of medical knowledge and profit. Conditions were unhygienic, and patients were denied proper care once experiments concluded. Many succumbed to their illnesses, while others endured prolonged suffering as data was meticulously recorded. Survivors remembered the agony of fever and delirium, combined with the hopeless realization that their deaths were scheduled outcomes. For the companies involved, prisoners were little more than free test subjects. At Dachau, business interests converged with ideology, creating a marketplace of human suffering. These experiments exposed the collusion between medicine and industry in the machinery of death. The justification for these medical atrocities was always couched in the rhetoric of war and necessity. Nazi doctors argued that knowledge gained from hypothermia and high-altitude tests would save German pilots and soldiers. Pharmaceutical trials were defended as vital for the production of new treatments to combat epidemics. Yet behind these justifications lay a deeper ideological conviction that certain lives were unworthy of preservation. The prisoners chosen for experiments were often Jews, Romani, Poles, and Soviet captives, groups deemed racially or politically inferior. Their expendability was the foundation of every so-called study. Doctors and SS officers operated with the assurance of impunity, knowing the state sanctioned their acts. The veneer of science was nothing more than a mask for sadism. In this way, medicine became a weapon of genocide. Dachau illustrated how science, when stripped of ethics, becomes indistinguishable from barbarity. The suffering inflicted through these experiments was described in harrowing detail by survivors and liberators. Inmates who endured hypothermia spoke of their bodies convulsing uncontrollably, their vision blurring, and their minds slipping into darkness. Survivors of pharmaceutical trials recalled the searing fevers of malaria, the unrelenting headaches of typhus, and the slow wasting of tuberculosis. Many testified that they envied the dead, as survival meant living with broken health and recurring nightmares. Allied soldiers who liberated Dachau later found detailed medical records, documenting each death with bureaucratic coldness. The evidence revealed how methodical the experiments were, reducing human agony to data points. These testimonies shocked the world and became vital during the Nuremberg doctors' trial. Survivors bore lifelong scars, both physical and psychological, from their ordeal. Their voices ensured that the crimes of Dachau would never be erased. Through their words, the memory of this cruelty remains unshakable. The complicity of the medical profession at Dachau stands as one of the darkest betrayals in history. Doctors, sworn to heal, became architects of torture. Many eagerly participated, seeing the experiments as opportunities for career advancement and scientific recognition. The SS Medical Corps provided institutional support, while prestigious universities and corporations sought the results. In this web of collaboration, individual morality was subordinated to ideology and ambition. Some doctors later claimed they acted under orders, but evidence shows many were enthusiastic participants. Their reports often emphasized precision and detail, as though detachment excused cruelty. The moral collapse of medicine at Dachau was not an accident but a choice. It revealed how easily scientific knowledge could be weaponized when stripped of ethical constraints. The betrayal of medical ethics at Dachau remains one of the most haunting lessons of the war. The legacy of Dachau's medical experiments endures as both warning and memorial. The crimes committed in the name of science forced the world to confront the necessity of medical ethics. The Nuremberg Code, established after the war, was a direct response to the atrocities uncovered at Dachau and other camps. It set principles of informed consent, voluntary participation, and humane treatment as cornerstones of research. Dachau's victims, many of whom never survived, became unwilling martyrs to this cause. Their suffering shaped a new global awareness of the dangers of unchecked science. Today, the memory of these experiments stands as a reminder that progress without morality leads to horror. The ruins of Dachau testify not only to the brutality of dictatorship, but also to the corruption of knowledge. Remembering these crimes ensures that the lessons remain alive. Dachau's medical experiments were not science, but a calculated perversion of it. Dachau was not only a site of forced labor and imprisonment, but also a carefully designed theater of cruelty. Punishment and torture became systematic tools to break the will of inmates and enforce total submission to SS authority. From the moment prisoners entered the camp, they knew that discipline was enforced through violence, often arbitrary and always terrifying. Guards wielded whips, clubs, and rifle butts with impunity, using them not only as instruments of punishment, but also as tools of psychological domination. The culture of brutality was ingrained. with SS officers often encouraging their subordinates to innovate new methods of torment. Orders were clear: every prisoner must be reminded daily of their worthlessness in the eyes of the Reich. Punishments were inflicted for real infractions, imagined offences, or simply to instill fear. The boundaries between discipline, sadism, and murder blurred until they became indistinguishable. Dachau thus evolved into a camp where survival depended not only on labor and luck, but also on navigating an environment of constant terror. Punishment was not incidental. It was central to the camp's function. One of the most common forms of punishment at Dachau was flogging, carried out with ritualistic cruelty. Prisoners accused of minor infractions such as talking back, failing to march in step, or stealing food were forced to bend over a wooden block. Guards then administered lashes with ox-hide whips or heavy sticks, often numbering in the dozens. The punishment was conducted publicly, ensuring that other prisoners witnessed the suffering as a warning. Victims screamed in agony, their skin split open, blood soaking their thin clothing. Some collapsed unconscious, while others were forced to count the lashes aloud under threat of restarting if they faltered. Survivors recalled the humiliation of being displayed as examples, their wounds left untreated to fester. In some cases, the punishment alone was fatal, either from shock or infection. Flogging represented more than discipline. It was a demonstration of the SS's absolute control over body and spirit. The cruelty was calculated to break individuals and enforce submission through pain. Another infamous method of punishment was confinement in standing cells. These cells were barely large enough for a single man to stand upright, often measuring less than 1 square meter. Prisoners were crammed inside for hours or days, deprived of the ability to sit, lie down, or stretch their limbs. Inmates described the agony of aching muscles, swollen legs, and collapsing from exhaustion, only to be propped against the walls in unconscious torment. Standing cells were dark, airless, and often overcrowded, with up to 4 men forced into a single space designed for one. The psychological strain was immense, as prisoners endured claustrophobia and suffocation alongside physical pain. Guards used these cells as punishments for minor infractions or as instruments of sheer cruelty. Many prisoners emerged broken, unable to walk properly for days, while others did not survive the ordeal at all. The cells symbolized the calculated use of deprivation as a weapon of control. Dachau turned immobility into torture, stripping away even the most basic human movement. The method known as tree hangings became one of Dachau's most feared punishments. Prisoners were bound with their hands tied behind their backs, and then suspended by their wrists from a tree or wooden post. The unnatural position dislocated shoulders, tore muscles, and caused excruciating pain in the chest and arms. Victims often lost consciousness, only to be revived and hung again until the guards were satisfied. This punishment was sometimes applied in front of other inmates, amplifying its psychological terror. Survivors described the cracking of joints, the burning sensation in their arms, and the agony of dangling helplessly while guards jeered. Some prisoners died from internal injuries, while others were permanently crippled. The spectacle reinforced the SS message: disobedience would be met with pain worse than death. Tree hangings were deliberately theatrical, turning suffering into a warning etched into the memory of every witness. It was punishment designed to linger not only in the body, but also in the mind. Beyond these punishments, Dachau also became a site of systematic executions, disguised as disciplinary measures. The camp possessed a firing range, ostensibly for training, but in reality used for mass shootings of prisoners. Victims were often brought under the pretense of transfers or special treatment, only to be executed on the spot. Guards lined prisoners against walls or in front of earth mounds, rifles aimed with mechanical indifference. Bullets cut down individuals or groups, their bodies hastily buried in mass graves nearby. Prisoners recalled hearing the gunshots from within the camp, knowing their comrades were being eliminated. The firing range became a place of whispered terror, its very mention evoking dread. Unlike punishments meant to break spirit, executions silenced prisoners permanently. They underscored the camp's dual purpose to enslave some and to kill others. Dachau's firing range remains one of the clearest testaments to its role as a site of hidden mass murder. The SS combined punishment with psychological manipulation to maintain total control. Prisoners never knew when or why they might be selected for flogging, hanging, or confinement. The randomness of discipline ensured that fear was constant, eroding trust, solidarity, and resistance. Guards often fabricated infractions, inventing offences such as laziness or disobedience to justify cruelty. Public punishments were staged deliberately to degrade not only the victim, but the entire prisoner community. Inmates were forced to watch executions, sometimes even compelled to carry out the aftermath by burying corpses. The intent was to break down any sense of dignity or autonomy. Survivors recalled the feeling of living under an invisible whip, knowing torment could come at any time. Dachau became a laboratory in psychological as well as physical control. By fusing arbitrary violence with spectacle, the SS created a climate where resistance seemed impossible. Punishment became both a tool of power and a performance of dominance. The brutality of Dachau's punishments left permanent scars on its survivors. Flogged prisoners carried deep welts and disfiguring injuries long after liberation. Victims of tree hangings often lost the use of their arms or lived with chronic pain. Those confined in standing cells emerged physically weakened, with lingering nerve damage and psychological trauma. Survivors testified that the anticipation of punishment was sometimes worse than the act itself. Living with constant dread drained their willpower and eroded their ability to endure. Yet even in such conditions, some prisoners found ways to resist silently, by refusing to betray comrades, by enduring without breaking, or by preserving dignity in small acts of defiance. These personal victories were rare but profound, representing the survival of human spirit against a regime that sought to extinguish it. Dachau's punishments thus became both a symbol of Nazi cruelty and of prisoner resilience. The scars bore testimony to both suffering and endurance. The legacy of punishment, torture, and executions at Dachau stands as a chilling reminder of how cruelty can be systematized. The methods perfected here, floggings, standing cells, tree hangings, and firing squads, were exported to other camps across the Reich. Dachau served as a training ground where SS officers learnt to wield pain as a weapon of control. After the war, survivors testified to these punishments, ensuring they could not be dismissed as exaggerations. The evidence was overwhelming, drawn from records, eyewitnesses, and the physical remains of the camp itself. Today, memorial sites preserve the memory of these practices, ensuring that future generations understand the depths of human-inflicted suffering. Dachau's punishments remind us of the dangers of unchecked power and the ease with which cruelty can become normalized. They also affirm the resilience of those who endured, whose stories survived when so many lives did not. In remembering Dachau's punishments, we confront the reality of terror as a tool of governance. The chapter closes with the enduring lesson that brutality, once unleashed, reshapes both victim and perpetrator forever. While Dachau itself became infamous as the prototype of the Nazi concentration camp system, its true reach extended far beyond the barbed wire of the main compound. As the war intensified, the SS created a sprawling network of subcamps scattered across southern Germany to feed the insatiable appetite of the Reich's war industries. These smaller camps were established near factories, quarries, railroads, and military installations, ensuring that prisoners' labor could be exploited directly where it was most needed. Subcamps multiplied rapidly, with estimates exceeding 140 sites tied administratively to Dachau by 1945. Each subcamp operated under brutal conditions, but they lacked the visibility and oversight of the main camp, which meant cruelty often flourished unchecked. Prisoners were transported from Dachau in overcrowded rail cars, weakened and starving even before reaching their new place of torment. In these outposts, inmates were often left to fend for themselves with minimal food, no medical care, and grueling workloads. SS overseers delegated much of the daily brutality to kappas, prisoners forced into positions of power. For many captives, life in a subcamp meant certain death through exhaustion, exposure, or violence. Dachau's shadow thus extended across the region, tightening its grip on thousands of lives. The industries that profited from Dachau's subcamps included some of Germany's most recognizable corporations. Companies like BMW, Messerschmitt, and Siemens eagerly accepted forced laborers provided through the SS system. Aircraft factories in particular demanded a steady stream of workers, and Dachau's prisoners became critical to the construction of fighter planes and other military hardware. Inmates were marched each day into workshops and assembly halls, their emaciated bodies bent over machinery until they collapsed. Supervisors regarded them not as humans, but as disposable tools, easily replaced from Dachau's endless reservoir of captives. Corporations supplied funding to expand subcamps, knowing that greater numbers of prisoners meant higher productivity. The SS ensured compliance through ruthless punishment of any laborer who failed to meet quotas. Workers received starvation rations that could never sustain the energy required for such labor, leading to staggering mortality rates. The alliance between SS brutality and corporate ambition transformed subcamps into engines of exploitation. This collaboration blurred the line between Nazi ideology and profit-driven pragmatism, ensuring that slave labor became a cornerstone of Germany's war economy. Conditions inside the subcamps were even harsher than those in Dachau itself. Prisoners lived in makeshift barracks, often converted barns, factories, or huts, with little insulation against freezing winters. Straw pallets served as bedding, infested with lice and soaked from rain leaking through broken roofs. Sanitation was non-existent, with a single latrine pit serving hundreds of inmates, spreading disease rapidly. Food rations were meager, often nothing more than watery soup and a crust of bread, incapable of sustaining heavy labor. Medical care was virtually absent, with sick prisoners simply left to die or dragged back to Dachau to be disposed of. Guards treated exhaustion not as a symptom but as defiance, punishing the weak with beatings or outright execution. In such conditions, survival hinged on luck, stolen scraps of food, and the solidarity of fellow inmates. For most, the subcamps became death sentences disguised as workplaces. The system revealed how Nazi Germany industrialized suffering, embedding it into every facet of its war machine. Among the most notorious Dachau subcamps was Kaufering, a network of 11 sites built near Landsberg am Lech. Here, thousands of Jewish prisoners were forced to construct underground bunkers for aircraft production, intended to shield German industry from Allied bombing. The work was relentless, involving excavation in rocky soil and the pouring of concrete under constant SS supervision. Starvation and disease ravaged the population, while brutal punishments ensured no slowing of the pace. Prisoners who collapsed were left in the mud, sometimes buried alive under construction debris. Kaufering became synonymous with extermination through labor, as the death toll climbed relentlessly with every passing week. Survivors later recalled the surreal horror of building vast military complexes, while knowing they would never live to see their completion. By early 1945, conditions had deteriorated into chaos, with corpses piled near unfinished bunkers as the Reich crumbled. Kaufring's legacy remains one of the starkest examples of Dachau's role in combining industrial ambition with genocidal cruelty. It demonstrated how slave labor served as both a weapon of war and a method of extermination. Another infamous subcamp system was Alec, located near Munich, which became a hub for manufacturing and construction. Alec housed thousands of prisoners tasked with producing components for BMW aircraft engines and other military hardware. Prisoners endured 12-hour shifts in suffocating workshops, their malnourished bodies failing under the demands of precision labor. Those unable to keep pace were beaten savagely or dispatched back to Dachau for execution. Conditions were worsened by the proximity of civilian workers, who often witnessed the suffering yet did nothing to intervene. At night, prisoners returned to overcrowded barracks, their bodies broken but their spirits forced to continue. Alec became the largest of Dachau's subcamps, symbolizing the seamless integration of forced labor into Germany's industrial heartland. The SS established a complex bureaucracy to manage production targets, treating human lives as expendable raw material. Mortality remained staggering, but replacements flowed continuously from Dachau itself. Alec epitomized the systemic exploitation that tied the camp network directly to the survival of Germany's war machine. The proliferation of subcamps revealed the adaptability of the Nazi concentration camp system. Unlike Dachau, which had fixed walls and established routines, subcamps were fluid, springing up wherever industry demanded. One month a subcamp might serve a munitions factory, while the next it was relocated to support a construction project. Prisoners were shifted like cargo, uprooted repeatedly, and forced into unfamiliar environments with no hope of stability. This mobility meant that conditions varied, but the underlying brutality never changed. The SS maintained strict control by appointing trusted guards and leveraging terror through capos. Bureaucratic oversight from Dachau ensured that death rates, productivity, and discipline were carefully recorded. Subcamps thus operated as satellites of the larger camp, extending its reach while maintaining its essential function as a machine of exploitation. Survivors recalled the despair of being transferred to yet another unfamiliar place of torment, realizing that each move brought only new forms of suffering. The subcamps were not exceptions, they were extensions of the same system of terror. The human cost of the subcamp network was staggering. Tens of thousands of prisoners perished from starvation, disease, overwork, and executions across these scattered sites. For many, the anonymity of their deaths was an additional cruelty. Unlike in Dachau, where records were sometimes maintained, subcamps often buried victims hastily or incinerated them without documentation. Families would never know the fate of their loved ones, lost in the machinery of war and bureaucracy. Survivors spoke of the loneliness of dying far from the main camp, without witnesses, memorials, or recognition. Entire communities of prisoners were wiped out, their labor consumed by projects that collapsed as the Reich fell. The subcamps became black holes of memory, absorbing human lives without leaving traces. Yet in scattered testimonies, survivors preserved the stories of comrades who did not return. Their accounts reveal the scale of loss and the cruelty of reducing human beings to nameless, expendable labor. The subcamps thus became both physical sites of exploitation and symbolic spaces of erasure. Today, the subcamps of Dachau stand as haunting reminders of the industrialization of slavery under Nazi rule. Many of their sites remain unmarked or reclaimed by modern development, their histories known only through survivor accounts and fragmentary records. Historians have worked painstakingly to document each subcamp, mapping the web of terror that once blanketed southern Germany. Memorials at Kulfering, Aletsch, and other sites now preserve the memory of those who perished, ensuring that the suffering is not forgotten. These locations remind us that Dachau was never confined to a single place, but radiated outward into the daily life of wartime Germany. Civilian industries, local populations, and corporate giants all became complicit in the crimes committed through the subcamp system. The story of Dachau's satellites is thus not only about prisoners, but also about the society that enabled their existence. Remembering them underscores the interconnectedness of ideology, industry, and exploitation. In reflecting on the subcamps, we confront the breadth of Dachau's legacy, its reach extending beyond its fences into every corner of the Reich's war effort. From its earliest days, Dachau was not just a prison for German dissidents, but a gathering point for the Reich's enemies across Europe. As the Nazi war machine expanded, the prisoner population became increasingly international, reflecting the vast territories under German domination. Poles, Soviets, French, Dutch, Belgians, Czechs, and Yugoslavs all found themselves behind the barbed wire, each group targeted for different reasons yet sharing the same fate. The camp became a microcosm of Europe under occupation, with national identities both preserved and eroded by shared suffering. Polish political prisoners were among the largest groups, captured after the invasion of 1939 and systematically deported to Dachau. French resistors followed after the fall of France in 1940, their courage branded criminal by the Nazis. Soviet prisoners swelled the ranks after Operation Barbarossa, treated with particular cruelty due to Nazi ideology. Yugoslav partisans, captured in brutal counterinsurgency campaigns, were also transported to Dachau. Each new influx expanded the camp's diversity, but also its human misery. In Dachau's barracks, Europe's nations met under the shadow of Nazi terror. Polish prisoners held a unique place in Dachau's history, both in numbers and in the severity of their persecution. From intellectuals and priests to resistance fighters, Poles were systematically targeted as part of Hitler's plan to decapitate Polish culture. Many were rounded up in mass arrests known as Intelligenzaktion, designed to remove leaders who might resist Germanization. Within Dachau, Poles were often singled out for the harshest punishments and hardest labor assignments. They were frequently forced into roles that broke their health rapidly, such as quarry work or construction projects. Clergy from Poland filled entire barracks as the Nazis attempted to weaken the Catholic Church, a central pillar of Polish identity. Despite these conditions, Polish prisoners maintained strong networks of solidarity, smuggling food, sharing prayers, and supporting weaker comrades. Their resilience became a vital lifeline for survival, though mortality rates remained devastatingly high. By the war's end, Poles represented one of the largest victim groups at Dachau. Their stories reflect both the suffering and the spirit of resistance that characterized international prisoners. Soviet prisoners of war and civilians endured perhaps the most brutal treatment within Dachau's system. Viewed as subhuman under Nazi racial ideology, they were denied the minimal protections afforded to Western Allied prisoners. Thousands were executed upon arrival, often marched directly to the firing range near the camp's perimeter. Those who survived the initial massacres were subjected to starvation rations, grueling labor, and medical experiments. Many were deliberately exposed to hypothermia, typhus, and other conditions under the guise of research. Others perished in quarries or industrial workshops, collapsing from exhaustion. The SS regarded Soviet lives as entirely expendable, and their mortality rate exceeded that of almost every other nationality. Survivors recalled that Soviet captives were often denied shoes, adequate clothing, or even straw bedding, forced to endure freezing nights with no shelter. Despite this, some Soviets organized acts of defiance, sabotaging machinery or passing on whispered words of encouragement. Their suffering underscored the ideological war against Bolshevism, where cruelty was not incidental but deliberate policy. French prisoners brought to Dachau included both captured soldiers and members of the resistance. After the fall of France in 1940, officers and resistors who opposed German occupation were arrested, interrogated, and deported. Many Frenchmen carried with them a sense of patriotic defiance, which translated into quiet forms of resistance within the camp. They smuggled messages, maintained underground networks, and helped preserve morale among fellow prisoners. French priests and intellectuals were also targeted, joining the already crowded barracks of clergy from Poland and Germany. In daily life, French prisoners endured the same brutal routines as others: endless roll calls, starvation rations, and exhausting labor. Yet their presence infused the camp with stories of defiance against occupation, a reminder that the war stretched across all of Europe. French survivors later testified to the deep bonds formed between nations inside Dachau, where language barriers fell before the universal struggle for survival. They also remembered the executions of comrades, lined up against walls or hanged before their eyes. For many, Dachau symbolized not only personal suffering, but the collective struggle of France under Nazi rule. Yugoslav prisoners were deported to Dachau in large numbers during the brutal occupation of their homeland. The Germans faced stiff resistance from partisans, and captured fighters were often sent to concentration camps as punishment. At Dachau, these men and women were treated with suspicion and singled out for brutal reprisals, accused of guerrilla tactics and sabotage. Many Yugoslavs perished in collective punishments, executed for acts carried out by resistance groups far beyond the camp's fences. Others were forced into construction work or agricultural labor, their bodies worn down by relentless demands. Yugoslav priests and intellectuals were also targeted, part of the Nazi strategy to dismantle cultural life. Survivors described the unique challenge of preserving identity amid such harsh treatment, often singing folk songs in whispers or marking holidays in secret. Despite these efforts, the toll was immense, with high mortality rates and widespread despair. Yugoslav prisoners, however, remained symbols of resistance against occupation, their presence a reminder of defiance even inside Dachau. Their memory lives on in testimonies that link camp suffering to the wider struggle in the Balkans. Other nationalities, though smaller in number, also left their mark on Dachau's multinational suffering. Dutch and Belgian prisoners, many arrested for resistance activities, joined the crowded barracks alongside Greeks, Czechs, and Hungarians. Romani captives, long persecuted by the Nazis, faced severe discrimination and were often funneled toward extermination. Even small groups of British, Norwegian, and Danish prisoners passed through Dachau, usually as intelligence agents or resistance fighters caught behind enemy lines. Each group brought its own language, culture, and coping mechanisms, which sometimes created divisions but more often forged solidarity. Prisoners exchanged scraps of news, translating bulletins or Red Cross letters to keep hope alive. Songs, prayers, and shared meals, even if only crumbs, bridged divides between nations. International prisoners realized that survival often depended on mutual support across national lines. The camp thus became a paradoxical place where Nazi policies of division gave rise to unity among the oppressed. In Dachau, the shared experience of suffering erased borders, replacing them with the bond of endurance. Life in an international community created both challenges and sources of strength for prisoners. Communication was difficult, as dozens of languages filled the barracks, often leaving individuals isolated. Yet necessity fostered creativity, with prisoners teaching each other words, sharing signs, or translating through intermediaries. Over time, friendships developed across cultural boundaries, offering moments of humanity in an otherwise dehumanized world. The multinational character of Dachau also exposed inmates to different survival strategies. Poles relied on religious solidarity, Soviets on sheer endurance, and French prisoners on underground networks. Together, these methods strengthened the camp's collective resilience. At the same time, divisions sometimes emerged, especially when scarce resources provoked conflict. The SS exploited these tensions, granting privileges to some groups while punishing others more severely. Despite these manipulations, the bonds forged in adversity often outlasted the divisions. For many survivors, Dachau became not just a place of suffering, but of unlikely international brotherhood. The memory of international prisoners at Dachau remains central to understanding its legacy. Today, national memorials stand within the camp to honor the Polish, French, Soviet, and other victims who perished there. Survivors' testimonies highlight how Dachau served as a crucible of suffering that transcended borders. Their accounts remind us that the camp was not merely a German institution of repression, but a site where the whole of occupied Europe was represented. The diverse national groups bore different burdens, but all shared the same fate of degradation and brutality. By examining their stories, we see how Dachau mirrored the global dimensions of World War II. It was not only a concentration camp, but a battlefield of ideology, where Nazi racial theories collided with the reality of European unity in suffering. Today, remembering these multinational prisoners serves as a warning against the dangers of nationalism and dehumanization. Their endurance and sacrifice remain powerful symbols of resistance and survival. Dachau's international character thus ensures that its story belongs not to one nation but to humanity as a whole. Dachau, though remembered as a predominantly male camp, was not devoid of women's presence within its system of oppression. While no female prisoner barracks existed inside the main Dachau compound, women became part of the wider network of subcamps and camp-related structures. Their roles ranged from serving as SS auxiliaries to working as guards in satellite facilities, where forced labor was essential. Some women functioned as typists, secretaries, or administrators, assisting in the bureaucratic machinery that sustained the camp. Others were trained at Dachau before being dispatched to female-only camps, such as Ravensbrück, or to oversee female prisoners elsewhere. Nurses attached to SS medical units also played critical roles, participating in or enabling medical experiments conducted on Dachau prisoners. These women were often recruited from German society, encouraged by Nazi ideology to see their work as patriotic service. Their presence in the camp's periphery illustrates how deeply Nazi structures absorbed ordinary citizens into systems of atrocity. In Dachau, women may not have been inmates in large numbers, but their roles as collaborators and facilitators of violence were undeniable. Their involvement complicates the narrative of Dachau as solely a male domain of terror. Among the most notable categories of women associated with Dachau were the female guards, who later staffed its extensive satellite camps. As Dachau's network expanded, particularly in the later war years, women were brought in to oversee prisoners forced into labor for the armaments industry. Many of these guards were trained in the methods of control, cruelty, and indoctrination pioneered within Dachau itself. They were instructed to treat prisoners as subhuman and to enforce discipline with physical violence when necessary. Some of these women earned reputations for their brutality, remembered in survivor testimonies as figures of terror. Others occupied seemingly mundane roles, standing at watchtowers or supervising work details, yet their presence reinforced the inescapability of SS power. The very fact that women were integrated into these functions underscores how deeply the Nazi regime normalized participation in atrocity across gender lines. They were not passive bystanders, but active enforcers of policies that degraded and destroyed human lives. Dachau thus reveals the way gender did not shield women from complicity in violence. Instead, it provided opportunities for them to become instruments of the camp system. Nurses represent another disturbing aspect of women's involvement with Dachau. While the title nurse traditionally evokes images of care and healing, the role of these women within SS medical units was often the opposite. Some assisted doctors in medical experiments that inflicted suffering and death on prisoners, such as hypothermia or infectious disease trials. They monitored victims, recorded data, and even administered injections that caused unbearable pain. Their tasks blurred the boundary between healer and executioner, transforming medicine into an arm of Nazi ideology. Survivor accounts describe the cold detachment with which these women carried out their duties, treating prisoners as test subjects rather than human beings. Many were motivated not only by ideological fervor, but also by career ambition within a system that rewarded loyalty to the Reich. Their participation highlights the corruption of professional ethics under dictatorship, where compassion was systematically replaced by cruelty. The presence of nurses at Dachau underscores how medical roles could be inverted to serve destruction. These women stand as a chilling reminder of how ordinary professions can be perverted in times of tyranny. Secretaries and administrative staff formed another layer of women's involvement in Dachau's operations. Often recruited from the civilian population, these women managed paperwork, processed prisoner records, and maintained communication between SS officers. Though their roles did not involve direct violence, they were integral to the functioning of the camp system. It was their typewritten lists that assigned prisoners to labor details, their files that recorded punishments, and their efficiency that ensured Dachau's machinery of repression ran smoothly. Many may have considered themselves distant from the brutality behind the barbed wire, yet their desks and typewriters were tools of oppression. Survivor testimonies recall secretaries who displayed indifference, laughing at jokes told by SS officers while prisoners suffered outside their windows. A few, however, quietly expressed sympathy, offering small acts of kindness such as turning a blind eye to smuggled letters. Yet the overwhelming evidence suggests that most operated within the system without questioning its morality. Their presence reflects how bureaucracy became the silent engine of Nazi atrocities. At Dachau, even the clerical tasks performed by women reinforced the machinery of terror. The relationship between women and prisoners was marked by both distance and power. Women guards rarely interacted with inmates on equal terms, instead maintaining authority through intimidation and violence. Survivors described being struck with sticks, shouted at relentlessly, or humiliated by female overseers. Nurses, though closer to prisoners physically, treated them as objects of study or disposal. Administrative women, insulated behind desks, wielded power invisibly, deciding fates through paperwork. These layers of involvement highlight the multifaceted ways women contributed to the atmosphere of control. While men remained the most visible architects of Dachau, women reinforced the structures that sustained it. Their roles may have seemed secondary, but collectively, they shaped the prisoner experience profoundly. For inmates, the presence of women in positions of authority shattered the expectation that femininity meant compassion. At Dachau, women too became part of the system of cruelty. Their influence cannot be underestimated in understanding the camp's dynamics. The stories of women connected to Dachau also reflect the spectrum of motivations within Nazi Germany. Some were ardent believers in Hitler's ideology, seizing opportunities to serve the Reich and advance socially. Others acted out of economic necessity, taking jobs as guards or secretaries when war disrupted civilian life. Still others joined due to peer pressure, cultural conditioning, or a desire to belong in a society where conformity was rewarded. Regardless of motivation, once inside Dachau's system, these women became part of its machinery of repression. Survivor accounts suggest that ideology often hardened their behavior, pushing them toward cruelty, even if they were not violent before. Ambition and the lure of authority also played a role, with women enjoying power they had never possessed in civilian society. For some, Dachau was not a prison, but a place of personal empowerment, achieved at the expense of others' suffering. This reveals the insidious nature of totalitarian systems, which draw ordinary individuals into extraordinary crimes. In Dachau, women's choices mirrored the broader complicity of German society. After the war, women associated with Dachau were not exempt from accountability. During the Dachau trials held by the Allies, several female guards and staff members were prosecuted for their roles in abuse and complicity. Testimonies from survivors often singled them out for cruelty, particularly in subcamps where women oversaw forced labor. Nurses faced scrutiny for their role in medical experiments, their professional titles offering no shield from responsibility. Secretaries and administrators, however, often slipped through the cracks of justice, dismissed as mere clerical workers. This uneven accountability reflects the difficulties of addressing gendered complicity in atrocity. Some women received prison sentences, others were executed, while many returned quietly to civilian life. Their post-war fates mirrored the broader struggle to confront the legacy of Nazi crimes. The trials exposed not only male brutality, but also female participation in sustaining Dachau's horrors. They forced societies to recognize that guilt and cruelty transcended gender. The history of women in Dachau complicates simplistic narratives of war and atrocity. Though smaller in number compared to men, their involvement reveals how deeply the Nazi system infiltrated every corner of society. Women served as guards, nurses, clerks, and collaborators, extending Dachau's reach into unexpected spaces. Their roles demonstrate that gender did not inoculate against complicity in violence. At the same time, the memory of their actions forces us to reflect on the universality of human choices under dictatorship. Ordinary women, like ordinary men, could become enablers of extraordinary cruelty. Today, their stories serve as a cautionary tale against assuming that any group is inherently immune to the temptations of power. Dachau teaches that systems of oppression thrive when ordinary roles are twisted to serve ideology. In remembering the women of Dachau, we confront uncomfortable truths about society's vulnerability to corruption. Their legacy reminds us that vigilance must always extend beyond the obvious perpetrators. By the year 1944, Dachau entered what could only be described as its most catastrophic phase. The camp, already burdened by years of brutality, now faced unprecedented levels of overcrowding. Prisoners from evacuated camps in the east poured into Dachau as the Nazis sought to conceal evidence of mass extermination. Trains crammed with thousands of men arrived daily, disgorging bodies weakened by starvation and disease. Barracks designed for 200 men now held over 2,000, with inmates packed onto bunks and floors like cargo. The stench of human waste, sweat, and sickness filled the air, making survival itself unbearable. Guards showed increasing indifference, often beating prisoners simply to control the chaos. The once rigid routines dissolved into confusion as SS officers scrambled to manage swelling numbers. Dachau, the prototype camp, became a dumping ground for a collapsing Reich. The conditions of 1944 marked the beginning of Dachau's descent into apocalyptic disorder. Overcrowding brought with it catastrophic consequences for food and water supplies. Meals, already meager, dwindled to watery soup with occasional scraps of bread, wholly insufficient to sustain life. Prisoners fought desperately over crusts, with the strong often overpowering the weak to snatch morsels. Water supplies became contaminated, as the infrastructure could not meet the needs of tens of thousands of inmates. Dysentery spread rapidly, weakening bodies further and accelerating death. For many, the hunger pangs were so severe that they resorted to eating grass, weeds, or even candle wax to quiet their stomachs. These desperate measures underscored the complete collapse of sustenance within the camp. Malnutrition left prisoners skeletal, their eyes sunken, and their skin stretched tightly over bones. Death from starvation became a daily occurrence, bodies piling in heaps before they could be carted away. Food ceased to be nourishment and became the most violent weapon of Dachau's final phase. Disease, particularly typhus, swept through Dachau like wildfire in the winter of 1944-45. The overcrowding created ideal conditions for lice infestations, which carried the deadly fever from one inmate to another. Prisoners developed rashes, high fevers, and delirium before slipping into death within days. Medical care was almost non-existent, as SS doctors focused their attention on experiments or abandoned the sick entirely. Barracks became makeshift hospitals where the dying lay in heaps, breathing their last surrounded by the stench of decay. Even guards feared entering certain blocks, terrified of contracting the disease themselves. Instead, they ordered prisoners to handle the bodies, spreading contagion further. Typhus, starvation, and exhaustion formed a triangle of death that consumed thousands within weeks. Testimonies from survivors describe a hellish environment where death was constant and corpses were never far from sight. The epidemic epitomized the disintegration of life inside Dachau. As the Allies advanced toward Germany, the SS resorted to death marches to evacuate prisoners from Dachau. In the spring of 1945, tens of thousands were forced to leave the camp on foot, herded into columns that stretched for miles. With little food, no rest, and constant abuse, many collapsed by the roadside. Guards shot those who fell behind, leaving ditches filled with bodies along the routes. Survivors recall the endless walking through rain, snow, and bitter cold, with only one goal: to stay alive for one more step. Farmers and villagers witnessed these processions of skeletal figures, often too afraid to intervene. The marches were not merely relocations but instruments of mass death, killing thousands through exhaustion, exposure, and bullets. For those who survived, the memory of these forced treks became one of the most haunting aspects of Dachau's legacy. The camp's horrors spilled into the countryside, leaving trails of corpses as grim markers. These marches revealed the Nazis' desperate cruelty in their final days. Inside Dachau itself, the crumbling infrastructure mirrored the collapse of the Reich. The crematoriums could no longer keep up with the number of dead, and corpses piled up in barracks, courtyards, and along fences. The smell of burning flesh became constant, choking the air and searing into the memory of survivors. Piles of emaciated bodies stood as silent testimony to a system that no longer bothered to hide its crimes. SS guards, once strict enforcers of order, grew increasingly disorganized and erratic. Some fled their posts, abandoning prisoners to chaos, while others became more violent, lashing out in frustration. The breakdown of discipline within the camp reflected the disintegration of Nazi authority itself. Yet the brutality did not diminish. If anything, it intensified in spasms of panic. Prisoners endured this twilight of terror with the faint hope that liberation might arrive. Dachau in these final months became both a slaughterhouse and a waiting room for freedom. The influx of prisoners from camps such as Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Flossenburg altered the makeup of Dachau's population dramatically. Inmates from across Europe now found themselves crowded together, bringing with them different languages, backgrounds, and survival strategies. Solidarity was difficult under such crushing conditions, but moments of shared humanity still flickered. Prisoners exchanged scraps of food, whispered words of encouragement, or shared news of approaching liberation. Yet divisions also deepened as scarcity drove some to desperation and betrayal. The camp became a microcosm of Europe itself, fractured, suffering, yet still clinging to life. Testimonies reveal that survival often depended on luck, connections, and the willpower to endure one more day. The chaos blurred distinctions between political, religious, and racial prisoners, as all became victims of neglect and disease. Dachau was no longer an organized machine of terror, but a collapsing, indiscriminate nightmare. The final phase brought all inmates to the edge of survival, regardless of origin. The psychological toll of Dachau's final phase was immense, pressing even the strongest inmates into despair. Witnessing endless death, hunger, and disease eroded the will to continue for many. Prisoners described a numbness setting in, where life and death blurred together in the same bleak routine. Some clung to faith, reciting prayers or recalling memories of family to preserve a sense of humanity. Others focused on small tasks, such as finding clean water or helping a sick comrade, to resist complete mental collapse. For many, rumors of Allied advances became the fragile thread that kept hope alive. SS guards attempted to crush morale with random executions, yet the nearness of liberation made their threat seem hollow. The final months were marked by a strange tension between utter despair and flickering hope. The human spirit bent under Dachau's weight, but did not fully break. These psychological battles were as critical to survival as food or shelter. The last phase tested both body and soul to their limits. By early 1945, Dachau stood as both a symbol and a reality of Nazi collapse. The camp had grown from a model of repression into a grotesque reflection of a regime in its death throes. Overcrowding, disease, and death marches transformed Dachau into an epicenter of late-war suffering. The SS no longer sought order, but only to hide their crimes and kill as many as possible before defeat. Prisoners bore the brunt of this chaos, enduring unimaginable conditions that remain etched in survivor memory. Liberation loomed, but it came too late for the tens of thousands who perished in those final months. When Allied forces finally approached, they encountered a camp overflowing with bodies and despair. Dachau's final phase illustrates not only the cruelty of the SS, but also the unraveling of Nazi power itself. The camp's collapse was inseparable from the Reich's own downfall. Yet for survivors, the scars of those months never faded, shaping their memories for the rest of their lives. On the morning of April 29, 1945, Dachau's gates were approached by men of the US 7th Army. These soldiers, hardened by months of combat across Europe, expected to encounter another battlefield, not the abyss of human suffering that lay within. As they advanced cautiously, the stench of decay struck them before they even entered the compound. Along the railway siding, they found train cars filled with thousands of corpses, emaciated, piled atop one another, their eyes staring lifeless into the sky. The soldiers were stunned into silence, confronted with a scale of death they had never imagined. Many had seen war's brutality, but this was different, systematic, cold, and industrialized. Survivors, skeletal and weak, crawled toward the Americans, their voices hoarse with disbelief that liberation had truly come. Some prisoners attempted to salute, while others fell to their knees in prayer. The scene was overwhelming, leaving even battle-hardened men in tears. Dachau's liberation began with shock, horror, and disbelief. As American troops entered the camp itself, they encountered a vision of hell on earth. Barracks overflowed with skeletal figures barely clinging to life, some too weak to rise from the wooden bunks. The floors were littered with the dead, many of whom had perished just hours before the liberators arrived. The stench was overpowering, a mixture of excrement, sweat, and decomposing flesh. Soldiers, unprepared for such sights, covered their faces with scarves and handkerchiefs in futile attempts to block the smell. Survivors, trembling and gaunt, extended hands toward their liberators, desperate for food, water, and reassurance. Inmates clung to their rescuers' uniforms, weeping uncontrollably and whispering words of gratitude in multiple languages. Many soldiers later admitted that they had to choke back rage and tears as they confronted the SS guards. The moment of entry was seared into memory, described by witnesses as the darkest revelation of the war. Dachau had transformed from a place of silence into a chorus of cries and sobs. The soldiers of the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions, known as the Rainbow and Thunderbird Divisions, played the leading roles in Dachau's liberation. These units had already fought across France and Germany, but nothing could prepare them for what they now faced. Men who had marched through artillery barrages and machine gun fire found themselves paralyzed by the sight of starving prisoners. Eyewitness accounts describe soldiers handing over their rations, chocolate, cigarettes, and bread, despite strict orders not to, as sudden food intake could kill emaciated survivors. Some knelt beside the dying, holding their hands in a final gesture of compassion. Others patrolled the camp in disbelief, recording everything in letters home that would later form some of the most vivid testimonies of liberation. For many, Dachau was not just a military mission, but a spiritual confrontation with evil itself. The young soldiers understood that history was watching through their eyes. The liberation of Dachau marked a defining moment in their lives. They would carry its memory forever. Survivors' testimonies from that day remain among the most haunting in Holocaust history. Men and women who had lost all hope suddenly saw foreign soldiers appear, clad in uniforms representing freedom and rescue. Many survivors recalled fearing that it was a trick, another cruel deception by the SS. When realization dawned, the camp erupted with cries of joy, sobbing, and frenzied embraces. Emaciated prisoners, weighing barely more than children, collapsed into the arms of their rescuers. Some survivors tried to sing national anthems or prayers, their voices breaking from weakness. Others could only whisper a single word: liberty. For those who had endured years of torment, the sight of Allied soldiers symbolized not only survival, but vindication that their suffering had not been unseen. Testimonies capture the indescribable mixture of joy and grief, relief and mourning. Liberation was both salvation and a confrontation with unimaginable loss. The humanitarian crisis that unfolded in Dachau after liberation was immense. Thousands of prisoners were too weak to move, many suffering from typhus, dysentery, and starvation. American medics scrambled to establish field hospitals, yet the sheer scale of illness overwhelmed available resources. Survivors, delirious from hunger, ate anything they could find, leading to sudden deaths from overeating. Doctors and nurses worked frantically, trying to stabilize patients with intravenous fluids, soups, and rest. Typhus raged unchecked, requiring quarantines and desperate attempts at delousing. Despite these efforts, hundreds continued to die each day in the weeks following liberation. Bodies were buried in mass graves or cremated as quickly as possible to prevent further spread of disease. Soldiers assisted in this grim task, understanding that even in liberation, Dachau remained a place of death. The camp became a field of both relief and despair. The SS guards captured at Dachau faced immediate consequences. As US soldiers grasped the enormity of what they had discovered, anger and revulsion boiled over. Eyewitness accounts confirm that some guards were executed on the spot by enraged troops, unable to reconcile what they had seen with notions of justice. Prisoners themselves also turned on their former captors, attacking them with sticks, stones, and bare hands. The thin line between justice and vengeance blurred in those chaotic hours. Official reports would later attempt to restrain these accounts, but the raw fury of liberation was undeniable. The image of starving prisoners standing beside dead guards symbolized the collapse of Nazi power. Dachau was no longer a fortress of oppression but a stage for reckoning. The SS, once feared masters of the camp, became helpless objects of rage and scorn. Liberation was both justice delivered and revenge unleashed. The liberation of Dachau was meticulously documented by soldiers, journalists, and photographers who accompanied the US Army. Images of emaciated prisoners, stacked corpses, and the infamous railway cars spread rapidly across the world. Newsreels captured the shocked faces of American troops, making Dachau a symbol of Nazi cruelty in the public eye. These images provided undeniable evidence for future war crimes trials. General Dwight D. Dare, Eisenhower himself, urged documentation, fearing that denial might one day attempt to erase these crimes. Survivors cooperated in sharing their stories, though many struggled to put words to the horrors they endured. The photographs and film footage became central to the world's understanding of concentration camps. Dachau's liberation was not only a military event, but also a historical revelation. The cameras ensured that the crimes uncovered would never fade into silence. The world had to see what had been hidden. April 29th, 1945, marked the end of Dachau as a functioning camp of terror, but not the end of its suffering. Survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding lives shattered by years of imprisonment, disease, and loss. Families had been destroyed, homes stolen, and entire communities erased. For many, liberation was only the beginning of a lifelong struggle with trauma. Yet the moment US forces opened Dachau's gates became a defining symbol of hope and justice. The camp stood as proof of the resilience of the human spirit. Even amid the most calculated cruelty, soldiers and survivors alike would remember that day as both the darkest and most profound of their lives. Dachau's liberation was a turning point in human history, a confrontation between humanity and inhumanity. The memory of April 29th remains a testament to the necessity of bearing witness. Liberation was the end of Dachau, but also the beginning of remembrance. After the liberation of Dachau, the world's attention quickly turned to the question of justice. The sheer scale of atrocities uncovered demanded not only humanitarian response, but also legal reckoning. The United States established military tribunals at Dachau itself, turning the site of suffering into a courtroom of accountability. These proceedings, later known as the Dachau trials, began in November 1945 and sought to prosecute the SS personnel, guards, doctors, and collaborators responsible. Unlike the Grand Nuremberg trials, which dealt with top Nazi leaders, Dachau's proceedings focused on crimes committed directly in concentration camps. The courtroom was filled with evidence, photographs, survivor testimonies, and detailed records kept by the SS. Prisoners turned witnesses stood bravely before their former oppressors, recounting unspeakable cruelty. The trials symbolized an attempt to impose order upon the chaos of genocide. They were both a legal exercise and a moral declaration to the world. Dachau, once a factory of death, now became a chamber of justice. The first Dachau trial, often called the main trial, focused on 40 defendants associated with Dachau's operation. These included camp commandants, doctors who conducted medical experiments, and SS guards implicated in killings and abuse. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of systematic brutality, including the infamous use of starvation, torture, and execution as instruments of control. Survivors delivered chilling testimonies describing in precise detail the crimes they had endured and witnessed. Their words carried immense weight, silencing the courtroom as listeners struggled to comprehend the depths of cruelty. Many defendants attempted to justify their actions by claiming obedience to orders, a defense that rang hollow in the face of such barbarity. American judges made it clear that crimes against humanity could not be excused by blind obedience. Of the 40 accused, 36 were found guilty, and many were sentenced to death. The verdict set an early precedent for international law in the post-war world. The trials proclaimed that Dachau's crimes would not fade into silence. One of the central themes of the Dachau trials was the reliance on survivor testimony. Men and women who had endured starvation, disease, and brutality now stood face to face with their tormentors. Their voices brought life to otherwise sterile documents and statistics. Survivors described floggings, forced labor, medical experiments, and executions, each testimony a fragment of truth, piecing together the camp's full horror. For many, testifying was an act of courage, reliving trauma for the sake of justice. The emotional weight in the courtroom was palpable as survivors broke down recounting beatings, hangings, and the deaths of loved ones. Judges, prosecutors, and even soldiers present often admitted later that they had never heard such raw human suffering articulated so directly. The power of these testimonies lay not only in their factual detail, but in their moral force. They gave voice to millions who had perished without a chance to speak. In Dachau's courtrooms, the dead were represented by the living. The trials also shed light on the bureaucratic nature of the Nazi system. Evidence revealed how cruelty had been carefully structured into regulations, memoranda, and orders. Commandants argued over responsibilities. Doctors recorded medical results from experiments, and guards filed routine reports of executions. The veneer of bureaucracy highlighted how ordinary men became instruments of extraordinary evil. Prosecutors emphasized that Dachau was not a crime of passion or chaos, but a system engineered for oppression and death. This realization shook many observers, who had to confront the fact that educated men, doctors, and officers had participated willingly. The banality of evil, expressed through paperwork and regulations, was exposed in full view. It became clear that Dachau was not only a camp, but also a machine of administrative efficiency, serving monstrous ends. The courtroom revealed that genocide could be conducted not just by brutality, but by meticulous order. The world learned that law itself could be perverted into a tool of destruction. The sentencing phase of the trials marked a historic moment in post-war justice. Many of those convicted of crimes at Dachau were sentenced to death by hanging, carried out within months of the verdicts. Others received long prison terms, ensuring that perpetrators would not easily escape accountability. The execution symbolized not vengeance, but the enforcement of international law against crimes too vast to ignore. Soldiers who had liberated Dachau often attended, still haunted by what they had seen in the camp. For survivors, justice was incomplete but necessary, a recognition that their tormentors would not walk free. The trials delivered a sense of closure, though nothing could truly balance the scales of suffering. Critics later argued that some sentences were too lenient, but at the time the proceedings were groundbreaking. Dachau's courtrooms proved that even amid devastation, law could prevail over atrocity. Justice, however imperfect, had been served. Beyond Dachau itself, the trials had a profound influence on international law. They established clear precedents for the prosecution of crimes against humanity, a term that had just entered the legal vocabulary. The idea that following orders was not a defense became a cornerstone of subsequent trials worldwide. The Dachau trials influenced later proceedings at Nuremberg and beyond, helping shape the Geneva Conventions and human rights law. Legal scholars studied the cases, noting how survivor testimony and documentary evidence could be combined to secure convictions. The trials also demonstrated the logistical difficulties of administering justice on such a scale. Thousands of Nazis had committed crimes, yet only a fraction could be prosecuted. Despite these challenges, Dachau's tribunals proved that accountability was possible. They established that atrocity on a massive scale did not exempt individuals from responsibility. Law had answered violence with judgment, setting an enduring legacy. The trials also carried symbolic weight for Germany and the world. Holding them at Dachau itself turned the camp into a site of transformation, from a prison of cruelty to a stage of accountability. Survivors and witnesses returned to the very place of their torment to see justice unfold. This symbolism was not lost on observers, who recognized the power of confronting evil in its birthplace. Dachau's courtrooms became a bridge between atrocity and remembrance, forcing the German population to face the crimes committed in their name. For the world, the trials affirmed that the horrors uncovered were not fabrications, but documented, judged, and punished. Newspapers carried stories of the verdicts, reminding readers everywhere of the dangers of unchecked power. The moral weight of Dachau's history pressed upon the conscience of humanity. Justice at Dachau was not only about punishing the guilty, but about educating future generations. The camp had been reclaimed by truth. Yet for many survivors, the Dachau trials were only a beginning. No sentence could erase the memories of starvation, humiliation, and death. No execution could resurrect loved ones lost in the barracks, the firing range, or the crematorium. Survivors often described justice as necessary but incomplete, a legal answer to crimes that were ultimately beyond comprehension. Still, the trials provided a platform for truth, ensuring that the world could no longer deny what had happened. They served as a warning that the machinery of terror could be dismantled, exposed, and judged. The legacy of the Dachau trials extends far beyond 1945, shaping how the world confronts genocide, dictatorship, and crimes against humanity. They remain a symbol of humanity's attempt to restore dignity to the victims by holding perpetrators accountable. Dachau's legacy of suffering was matched by a legacy of judgment. Justice, however limited, became part of its history. When the war ended and the trials concluded, Dachau's story did not simply fade into history. It became a powerful symbol of memory and legacy. The campgrounds, once a place of horror, were initially used by the US Army to house SS prisoners awaiting trial. Later, parts of Dachau were even repurposed to shelter refugees and displaced persons struggling in the post-war chaos. Yet survivors and activists insisted that Dachau must never return to normal use, that it had to remain a place of remembrance. Over the years, campaigns emerged to preserve the camp and to acknowledge its significance as the first Nazi concentration camp. The survivors' voices carried the weight of truth, reminding societies of the dangers of forgetting. By the 1960s, Germany began to formally transform Dachau into a memorial site. This marked a turning point in how post-war Germany confronted its Nazi past. Dachau became not only a physical place, but a moral reminder. It symbolized both horror and responsibility. The Dachau Memorial Site, officially opened in 1965, was created through the efforts of survivors and supported by Bavarian authorities. It stood as one of the first concentration camp memorials in Germany, setting an example for others to follow. Survivors worked closely with historians to reconstruct parts of the camp, ensuring that visitors could see and feel the environment where cruelty had unfolded. Barracks were rebuilt, watchtowers restored, and the crematorium preserved as stark evidence of atrocity. Museums were created to hold original documents, photographs, and personal artifacts. Every brick, every wall was meant to carry testimony for future generations. The site did not simply tell a story of German guilt, it sought to preserve the memory of those who suffered and perished. Dachau's transformation into a memorial was itself an act of moral resistance against forgetting. By preserving horror, the world could better guard against its return. The camp was reborn as a classroom of history. Central to Dachau's memorialization were the survivors' voices. Many former prisoners dedicated their lives to speaking in schools, writing memoirs, and guiding tours of the camp. Their testimonies went beyond statistics, breathing human life into historical fact. They recounted the cold mornings of roll call, the endless hunger, the screams from the punishment blocks, and the quiet acts of solidarity that preserved humanity. These accounts gave generations of Germans and international visitors a direct link to the lived experience of Dachau. Survivors did not only describe their suffering, they reminded listeners of the dangers of prejudice, hatred, and blind obedience. They insisted that Dachau must not be remembered only as German history, but as universal human history. Every testimony became a warning: what happened once could happen again. As survivors aged and passed away, their recorded words and writings became even more precious. Memory became not just an act of recall, but an obligation. Education has been at the heart of Dachau's legacy. From school visits to international study programs, Dachau became a place where young people confronted the reality of history. Teachers, historians, and guides encouraged students to walk the paths prisoners had walked, to stand in the barracks, and to reflect on what hatred had built. Exhibitions evolved to include not only the Nazi era, but also lessons about human rights and moral courage. The Dachau Memorial Site offered programs that connected the Holocaust with modern struggles against racism, dictatorship, and genocide. By linking past and present, Dachau ensured that its legacy was not confined to dusty history books. Education at Dachau was not about memorizing dates, but about understanding responsibility. Visitors left with questions about their own societies, their own prejudices, and their own potential for action. Dachau became not just a memorial, but a global classroom. Its lessons transcended national boundaries. International remembrance also played a crucial role in Dachau's legacy. Delegations from across the world visited the site, from heads of state to student groups. Jewish organizations emphasized Dachau's role as a precursor to extermination camps like Auschwitz, while Catholic and Protestant groups remembered the thousands of clergy imprisoned there. Eastern European nations commemorated their citizens who had died within Dachau's walls. Ceremonies held at the site often included representatives of different religions and cultures, turning remembrance into a universal act. Dachau became a place where national histories intersected, united by the shared memory of suffering. The camp's multinational prisoners had turned Dachau into a global symbol of injustice. In honoring their dead, nations affirmed their collective humanity. Dachau's message grew far beyond Germany. It became a voice in the world's conscience. Its soil carried an international warning: never again. Yet, Dachau's legacy also confronted silence, denial, and controversy. In the early post-war years, many Germans were reluctant to speak of the camp, fearing shame or preferring to forget. Some locals resented the transformation of Dachau into a memorial, wishing to distance themselves from its past. But survivors pushed relentlessly against this silence. They insisted that facing history was the only way to overcome it. Through decades of effort, their persistence turned Dachau into a central part of Germany's culture of remembrance. The struggles over memory reflected the larger struggle of post-war German society to reckon with guilt and responsibility. Dachau symbolized the tension between forgetting and remembering. Ultimately, remembrance triumphed. Though it remained an ongoing process, Dachau taught that memory must be fought for. Without constant vigilance, history risks fading into myth. Dachau's legacy extended into international law, ethics, and human rights. The medical crimes committed there were central in shaping the Nuremberg Code, which defined modern standards for medical ethics. The trials held at Dachau set precedents for prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity. Historians, philosophers, and legal scholars used Dachau as a case study in how societies descend into organized cruelty. The camp's memory fed into the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Its story underscored the importance of legal safeguards, democratic institutions, and global cooperation. The lessons of Dachau lived not only in remembrance, but in institutions that sought to protect future generations. Dachau became more than a symbol of horror. It became a foundation for human rights advocacy. In every law against torture, every treaty on human dignity, the shadow of Dachau lingered. The camp's crimes shaped a more vigilant world. Memory became law. Today, Dachau stands as both a place of mourning and a place of learning. Visitors walk through its gates not as prisoners, but as witnesses to history. The barbed wire, the barracks, and the crematorium remain as silent testimony, while exhibitions remind them of the lives once lost there. Survivor voices echo through recordings, photographs, and writings, ensuring that their memory does not vanish with time. Dachau's place in the collective conscience of the world is secured by its enduring lessons. It is a reminder of the fragility of freedom, the dangers of prejudice, and the necessity of vigilance. Dachau asks every visitor not simply to remember but to act, to defend human dignity wherever it is threatened. Its legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of those who confront its history. Dachau is not just a relic of the past, it is a challenge to the present. Memory has become responsibility,